So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Laura Belandia, and once again, I say welcome to a new INISEG event. I am really happy to have you here today in this great event. This is going to be a special day, a day full of analysis that we will be getting to know a different version and visions on what happened in this historical milestone that was the Vietnam War. This event, organized by INISEG, the International Institute for Global Security and Studies, and AUSA, the Association of the United States Army. So we want to somehow coordinate and organize a different event that will support the student of our master's degree in military history. And we want to expand this type of content of the public and anyone interested who wanted to participate. INISEG has always been charity but committed and to contribute to the society with research, analysis, point of view, real experience, studies, and research of these historical events that make history of everything related to the security and defense area. So today we are going to start full of spectacular speakers who will give an incredible presentation of the Vietnam War. So in addition, in the end, we will have a question and answer section, question that will be able to ask all the speakers, and that will be discussed between 2 or 3 speakers, depending on the question. And please, of course, write in the chat these questions. I would like to start by introducing the 2 people who are part of the organization of this event. One, we have a Lieutenant General Guy Swan, Vice President of the Association of the United States Army, with more than 35 years of service in the Army, and has participated in countless seminars and events at international level, and is an expert in military history. So, Lieutenant General Guy Swan, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and welcome to this incredible event. So while our General connect, please, we continue with David. I want to introduce David de Caizal, our Director of the Security and Defense area of INISEG, military historian and the expert in international geostrategy and jihadist terrorism. He is also our professor in the master's degree in military history. So David, the audience is all yours.
Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por participar en este evento. Como me ha presentado Laura, como director del área de seguridad y defensa de INISEG, soy el director de este máster oficial de historia militar de INISEG, en el cual pues, organizamos este evento internacional sobre la guerra de Vietnam, el cual se enmarcará este evento académico sobre este conflicto y este seminario online que nos llevará los días 23, 24 y 25 de febrero, todas las tardes. Desde INISEG, en colaboración con AUSA, en relación del Ejército de los Estados Unidos, hemos organizado este evento académico internacional en conmemoración de la guerra de Vietnam. Como muy bien sabemos, la guerra no es una novela de aventuras, es una gran tragedia. En este seminario hemos querido analizar cuáles fueron las causas y consecuencias de la derrota francesa en Indochina y, claro está, la intervención norteamericana y de otros países aliados en el conflicto y el por qué perdió Estados Unidos en la guerra de Vietnam. Este seminario realizaremos un merecido recuerdo a esos jóvenes norteamericanos enviados al sudeste asiático como carne de cañón, patriotas que soñaban con emular a John Wayne, críos de 17 años que esperaban en el barco frente a las costas vietnamitas a cumplir la mayoría de edad. Jóvenes inconformistas, engañados, pobres en su mayoría, niños convertidos en ancianos tras pasar unos meses en el infierno de las selvas de Vietnam. La guerra de Vietnam, llamada también Segunda Guerra de Indochina y conocida en Vietnam como Guerra de Resistencia contra Estados Unidos, fue un conflicto bélico librado entre 1955 y 1975 para impedir la reunificación de Vietnam bajo el gobierno comunista. Vietnam, del antaño vivió pues, un infierno de más de 30 años en el que murieron entre 3 y 5 millones de personas, al igual que Estados Unidos sufrió más de 58.000 bajas en combate. Pero lo increíble de esa guerra es que la mayoría de los hombres y mujeres que lucharon en Vietnam volvieron en silencio, sin fanfarria y sin apoyo, y se convirtieron en maridos y mujeres, padres y madres, miembros respetables de su sociedad, heridos pero resilientes. Cientos de hombres y mujeres que sirvieron en ese conflicto reconocen que estuvieron años sin hablar de ello, sin contar a nadie que habían ido a la guerra, sin llorar, reprimiendo sus sensaciones para que no se fuera todo al traste. Otros admiten que no querían volver a Estados Unidos, que sabían que nada bueno les iba a esperar fuera de Vietnam, se habían vuelto adictos al horror. En este seminario de 3 días podremos conocer todos los detalles de este importante conflicto bélico, desde la batalla de Dien Phu en el 54 y la derrota francesa en la Primera Guerra de Indochina, pasando por el incidente del Golfo de Tonkin en 1964 y la intervención norteamericana en el conflicto con diversas importantes batallas contra el Vietcong y las fuerzas de Vietnam del Norte, hasta la retirada de 1975 de Saigón, que pues, evidentemente pues, pondría punto y final a la presencia de Estados Unidos en Vietnam y finalizaría la Segunda Guerra de Indochina. Un grupo de expertos, analistas y militares y académicos de diversos países discutirán sus puntos de vista acerca de este acontecimiento histórico. Desde INISEG queremos agradecer a las instituciones participantes en este evento su colaboración para poder realizar para todos ustedes este importante evento internacional sobre la guerra de Vietnam. Muchas gracias, Laura.
Vamos a dar unos minutos. Nuestro general Guy Swan está conectándose para que inicie también con su presentación inicial. General Guy Swan.
Yes. Laura, do you have me now?
Yeah, of course. How
Great.
are you? It's a pleasure to have you here today and welcome to this incredible event.
Well, thank you, everyone. And it's great to be with you. I participated with the Institute a few months ago on a wonderful seminar on the history of the Normandy invasion in 1944. And it's good to be back with all of our friends for a wonderful couple of days. As most of you know, the Vietnam War was one of the most significant conflicts of the 20th century, spanning a period of nearly 3 decades from the French experience, starting with the French experience in the early 1950s, through the American involvement in the 1960s and early 1970s. While a significant number of Americans, Vietnamese on both sides and others, served during the Vietnam War and experienced it firsthand, virtually everyone around the world saw the Vietnam War in their own homes, as it was truly the first television war. And I think that'll be discussed here over the next few days. The Vietnam War occurred during a time of great social, political, and ideological upheaval, not just in the United States, but around the globe. Some would say the war actually contributed to much of that turmoil that we saw in the 1960s and early 1970s. But one thing for sure is that the Vietnam War touched everyone at that time. We at the Association of the United States Army are proud to partner with the International Institute for Global Security Studies once again for this important seminar examining the history and impact of the Vietnam War. For many in the United States and elsewhere in the West, the Vietnam War was seen as an extension of the Cold War, a proxy war, if you will, with the Soviet Union in the bitter battle against world communism. And while it was largely an American war fought by American and South Vietnamese soldiers, there were other partner nations and allies who sent their soldiers to fight as well, most notably South Korea and Australia, and some of that will be discussed here as well. But what about the other side, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong? What were their experiences? What were their leaders trying to accomplish? And what were the goals of their allies in the Soviet Union and Communist China That ought to be an interesting discussion as well. Over the next 3 days, we'll hear from several prominent historians and experts as we examine one of the most consequential conflicts of the post-World War II era, and perhaps in the entire history of warfare. We'll examine the Vietnam War from virtually every angle and perspective. We'll look at the global environment, the strategy, the planning, and the major combat operations of the war. We're really looking forward for all of you joining us and participating in this wonderful journey back to the rice paddies, mountains, monsoons, and jungles of Southeast Asia as we continue to learn many lessons about and from that fateful conflict. Timeless lessons of perseverance, failure, success, determination, leadership, and yes, even heroism. And once again, on behalf of the Association of the United States Army, we're proud that we could participate, and we look forward to a great couple of days of discussion. So Laura, with that, back over to you.
Thank you very much, General Swan, for those words and for that great start to this event on the Vietnam War. Thank you so much. So, David, vamos a dar inicio a nuestro primer ponente. Estás en mute.
Sí, disculpar, vamos a presentar al primer ponente de la tarde. Sí, vamos a presentarles al doctor Eduardo Juárez, que es doctor en Geografía e Historia, es profesor de INISEG y de la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, y su ponencia hablará sobre la inteligencia militar en la guerra de Vietnam. Eduardo, muchas gracias. Cuando quieras, tienes la palabra.
Hola, buenas tardes aquí desde España a todos los participantes en este seminario tan apasionante, ¿no? Voy a intentar, bueno, como hice en el evento anterior, el del año pasado, en el que tratamos el día D, voy a intentar ser lo más conciso posible, porque hay muchas ponencias y uno siempre piensa que lo que va a exponer es lo más importante, ¿no? Y podría estar horas hablando acerca del papel de las estructuras de inteligencia en la guerra de Vietnam. Bueno, yo lo que les voy a proponer en esta comunicación que voy a aportar es, por una parte, intentar escrutar, ¿no?, el proceso de la lucha o la guerra que desarrollaron en Vietnam los servicios, las estructuras de inteligencia, en ver aquellos puntos básicos y esenciales dedicados a esta lucha por la información, en el punto y en el modo que fuere, y después llegar a unas pequeñas conclusiones qué produjo la guerra de Vietnam desde el punto de vista de la inteligencia. Bueno, vamos a ver, voy a intentar compartir mi pantalla porque tengo un PowerPoint que me gustaría que se viera, ¿no? De modo que voy a ver si encuentro, vamos a ver primero, voy a minimizar esto un poquito, eso es, ok. Voy a abrir mi PowerPoint y voy a intentar compartirlo. A ver si me deja. Aquí está. Ok. Ya tengo compartido mi PowerPoint. Creo que ya lo están viendo, si no me equivoco. Sí. Ok, perfecto, ¿no? Si no se ve, pues díganmelo e intento solucionar el problema, pero vamos, creo que ya se ve, ¿no? Bien, el año pasado, en el evento que hablamos del día D, pues yo creo que hablábamos de unos modelos de estructuras y servicios de inteligencia que, en lo que se refiere al desarrollo del conflicto en la guerra de Vietnam, podemos decir claramente que estaban completamente obsoletos, es decir, no se trataba de estructuras que fueran hábiles o precisas a la hora de generar la inteligencia suficiente que pudiera asesorar o permitir la toma de decisiones de las diferentes unidades enfrentadas en aquella guerra de una forma eficaz o eficiente, ¿no? Bueno, en términos generales, si nos referimos, a ver, eso es, refiriéndonos aquí, a lo que es la guerra de Vietnam, como ya he dicho, General Swan, hay que enmarcarla, y también lo ha dicho David, hay que enmarcar la guerra de Vietnam en el proceso de la Guerra Fría, ¿no? La Guerra Fría obviamente supone un periodo de enfrentamiento entre dos bloques, el resultado de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, del final, del cierre, diríamos, en frío, ¿no? El mal cierre en frío de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, que provocó el alineamiento frente a dos bloques, dos modelos de ver la sociedad, uno claramente capitalista, el otro socialista. Ambos puntos de vista generaron dos bloques en los cuales fueron yendo, sumándose diferentes entidades políticas de todo el mundo hasta generar un frente de choque entre esas dos opciones. El periodo es larguísimo en términos históricos, desde luego en historia contemporánea, quiero decir. El periodo es larguísimo, desde el 47 hasta el 79, básicamente. Es muy complicado el poder comprender de forma lineal lo que supuso la Guerra Fría. Sí que es cierto, en lo que se refiere al uso de las estructuras de inteligencia, que podemos hablar de dos líneas de enfrentamiento desarrollados en este periodo, que es la Guerra Fría, ¿no? Por un lado, aquellas políticas o medidas tomadas como contención del rival, que bien podían ser políticas de carácter económico, como fue el Plan Marshall, ¿no? Una política que intentaba establecer o asociar el modelo capitalista a regímenes democráticos parlamentarios, idea que todavía sigue persistiendo a día de hoy, ¿no? La creación de agrupaciones militares con carácter preventivo para atemorizar o por lo menos controlar cualquier avance, cualquier decisión del contrario, como fue la creación de la NATO, de la OTAN o del Pacto de Varsovia, ¿no? El otro camino que podemos apreciar en esta Guerra Fría, que es quizás el que más nos interesa en el seminario en el que nos encontramos, es lo que he venido a llamar la guerra diferida, ¿no? Es decir, el enfrentar los dos bloques no directamente, sino a través de un tercero, ¿no? Que puede ser a través de guerras en las cuales uno de los bloques puede estar directamente implicado, como puede ser la guerra de Corea, como ocurre en la guerra de Vietnam, precisamente porque el proceso de contención o el proceso de guerra diferida con terceros fracasa y obviamente a través del proceso me ha gustado llamarlo, he decidido llamarlo, del golpeo, del ataque de estados, ¿no? Golpeando estados, ¿no? Desde ese punto de vista, golpeando estados, es más que evidente que durante la Guerra Fría se suceden diferentes enfrentamientos, diferentes procesos bélicos que, como les he dicho, bien pueden provocar que alguno de los bloques, en este caso de los líderes de cada bloque, como era la Unión Soviética y los Estados Unidos, se vieran implicados directamente, o bien que se desarrollara un enfrentamiento a través de un tercero, ¿no? En ese caso podemos ver el caso de Cuba, podemos ver China, incluso República Dominicana o Argentina, donde estas tendencias de la lucha, el enfrentamiento de bloque, se realiza a través de un tercero que es el Estado que queda golpeado, ¿no? Son estos en los que me estoy refiriendo, donde más influencia pudieron tener las estructuras de inteligencia, ¿no? de ambos bloques. En este caso, bueno, algunas de ellas citaremos a lo largo de esta breve comunicación, ¿no? En el caso de la guerra de Vietnam, la guerra de Corea o la posterior guerra de Afganistán, es un tipo de conflicto que efectivamente golpea a un Estado, pero que implica directamente a uno de los protagonistas o de los líderes de cada uno de esos bloques que, bueno, evidentemente va a sufrir el proceso bélico de forma directa, ¿no? Hay otras formas de conflicto que golpean estados donde bien se lucha para prevenir la expansión del comunismo, bien se afianza un modelo comunista o bien se previene la extensión en países cercanos de esta opción comunista socialista, ¿no? Esa idea de la teoría, ¿no? del dominó, ¿no? El caso de la Operación Cóndor que se desarrolla en América Latina, pues yo creo que es evidente, ¿no? A partir de los golpes de Estado que desarrollan dictaduras de carácter capitalista, con militares, por supuesto, como en Chile y en Argentina, y que provocan esa operación o esa decisión de emplear estructuras de inteligencia para frenar cualquier tipo de avance y eliminar cualquier tipo de insurgencia contra un modelo preestablecido, sea este modelo de carácter democrático o no, porque aquí sinceramente no estamos hablando de cuestiones ideológicas o filosóficas, sino básicamente del uso de estructuras e infraestructuras diseñadas para la captura y gestión de información y la creación de inteligencia, ¿no? Desde ese punto de vista, pues comprenderán que la Guerra Fría es el paraíso para aquel que estudia y se interesa, como es mi caso, en las estructuras de inteligencia, ¿no? Estas estructuras, como les he dicho, he empezado hablando de aquel evento que tuvimos el año pasado, en el mes de julio, sobre el día D, sobre el día del desembarco de Normandía, ¿no? Y todo el proceso de gestión de información y sobre todo aquellas operaciones de decepción que se llevaron a cabo, aquellas estructuras de inteligencia que provocaron o que generaron esas posibilidades de desarrollar o de provocar una desinformación total en el enemigo, en este caso en Alemania nazi. Bueno, pues esas estructuras de inteligencia, como ya les he dicho, carecían o hubieran carecido claramente de efectividad en un entorno tan complejo como el de la guerra de Vietnam. Hasta el momento del inicio de la Guerra Fría podemos decir que había dos tipos de estructuras de inteligencia. Las estructuras de inteligencia de carácter militar, que básicamente son defensivas, que tienen como objetivo aprender del enemigo para poder contrarrestarle, y luego las estructuras de información que el objetivo básico no es tanto el carácter pasivo o la anticipación con la información de prevenir los ataques del antagonista, sino más bien un carácter de contrainteligencia y sobre todo de control social, es decir, de control de la información de la sociedad donde se establece la base esencial de esa estructura de inteligencia. En el primer caso, pues he puesto dos ejemplos, yo creo que son esenciales, ¿no? Como el Upware o el GRU, y en el segundo caso, el NKVD, yo creo que es más que evidente. A partir del inicio de la Guerra Fría, a partir del año 48 o 49, las estructuras de inteligencia ya precisan de una mayor complejidad, la desinformación, la gestión de la información, la infiltración, la contrainteligencia, la contrainsurgencia, la insurgencia, son factores que complican mucho más la guerra desde un punto de vista general, ¿no? Así pues, las estructuras de inteligencia no tienen más remedio que no cambiar, sino adaptarse a este nuevo escenario. Es una adaptación muy complicada, como podrán comprender. Aquí no hay un manual de instrucciones cuando hay un cambio de paradigma militar, de paradigma de combate, de paradigma en general histórico y militar. No hay un manual que enseña a las estructuras preexistentes a evolucionar hacia aquello. Se evoluciona del modo en que se puede. A veces se evoluciona muy bien, a veces se evoluciona fatal. Generalmente las evoluciones en lo que se refiere a las estructuras de inteligencia no están conectadas con un proceso de ensayo-error, pero sí están conectadas con un proceso de decepción clara y evidente, de fracaso y evolución a partir del mismo, ¿no? Estas estructuras de inteligencia o superestructuras de inteligencia y contrainteligencia, bueno, aquí tienen un ejemplo, ¿no?, de algunas de las que van a integrar estas superestructuras a partir ya de la Guerra Fría y que es en el mundo en el que nos encontramos ahora. Pues no nos olvidemos que estamos en una situación clara y evidente de preguerra en el este de Europa, donde es importantísimo esta gestión de las estructuras de inteligencia, no tanto ya para conseguir un éxito en una posible guerra, sino como para prevenirla y estar atentos a cualquier tipo de movimiento que pueda impedir, ¿no?, un proceso que desde muchos puntos de vista parece a día de hoy inevitable, ¿no? Bueno, las estructuras de inteligencia, como les he ido diciendo, antes de la guerra de Vietnam, esas estructuras de inteligencia de carácter militar, bueno, un ejemplo claro y evidente es el Abwehr nazi, ¿no?, donde el carácter defensivo, ¿no?, de la estructura, sobre todo militar, y su capacidad de reacción ante una ofensiva o una situación defensiva, bueno, pues generaban estructuras de este tipo, muy sencillitas, digo muy sencillitas desde el punto de vista, muy sencillas desde el punto de vista actual, ¿no?, pero sobre todo estructuras de inteligencia orientadas básicamente a la protección de la acción militar, ya sea defensiva u ofensiva, y a la protección de los recursos esenciales básicos que puedan dar preeminencia o ventaja, ¿no?, a una entidad, a un país, una entidad o una alianza, ¿no? En el otro objetivo, en el otro modelo que les he dicho, el modelo de la gestión más bien de la contrainteligencia, el control social, el NKVD, que evoluciona de la CHK de 1922, evidentemente, ese carácter policial de control social, de prevenir cualquier tipo de infiltración, para prevenir cualquier tipo de desviación dentro de la propia sociedad que genera, digamos, ese esfuerzo bélico, ese esfuerzo competitivo, pues yo creo que es evidente, ¿no? Obviamente estamos hablando de dos modelos de sistemas de inteligencia, de estructuras de inteligencia, que son claramente enmarcados en un entorno no democrático, con lo que significa para el desarrollo de una estructura de inteligencia, ¿no? Con la llegada de la Guerra Fría, evidentemente, nos encontramos con otra situación, ¿no? La situación es que estas estructuras de inteligencia, estas estructuras de información deben integrarse dentro de un marco superior, ¿no? A partir de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y con un mundo dividido en bloques, con múltiples frentes para controlar, con múltiples insurgencias o contrainsurgencias, aunque sean políticamente hablando y no sobre el terreno, pues se van a desarrollar estructuras de inteligencia que son globales, que aunan múltiples facetas dentro de un mismo sistema. Esto es, ya no hablamos de una estructura de carácter militar, ya no hablamos de una estructura de carácter político, social, ya no hablamos de estructuras de inteligencia, de contrainteligencia, sino que hablamos de múltiples estructuras de inteligencia coordinadas en una superestructura, ¿no? Una superestructura que son los modelos entre los que nos movemos hoy en día, ¿no? El ejemplo del Mossad, ¿no? Con las múltiples secciones, o el modelo estadounidense con múltiples estructuras ordenadas en una superestructura. He de decir que este modelo de superestructura de inteligencia es muy cuestionable, sobre todo durante la guerra de Vietnam. Incluso hoy en día, después de muchos de los sucesos que ha experimentado, en concreto los Estados Unidos, en el ejercicio del liderazgo global, pues han provocado mucho cuestionamiento a la hora de esa superestructura con un mando único, que yo creo que es de lo último que voy a hablar y espero que no hablar demasiado para no comerme tiempo de ninguno de mis colegas en el evento, ¿no? Superestructuras que, como ven, estamos hablando no de una estructura de inteligencia, como era el caso del Abwehr durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, sino que hablamos de una superestructura de inteligencia, como es el caso de los Estados Unidos, donde diferentes unidades, estructuras menores, menores quiere decir que se especializan en un proceso de inteligencia o contrainteligencia, deben trabajar bajo un mismo mando con un único objetivo, ¿no? El ejemplo de los Estados Unidos y, por supuesto, lo que no ocurre en las estructuras que hemos visto antes, propias de sistemas no democráticos. Me refiero al control por parte de la ciudadanía a través de los representantes elegidos a través del proceso del proceso electoral, quiero decir, ese poder legislativo, esa derivada que tiene de control de estos servicios de inteligencia, esas comisiones de seguridad que son necesarias y que en términos de desarrollos y de efectividad de los servicios de inteligencia, de estas superestructuras de inteligencia, suelen ser más un freno que un acicate, ¿no? Está mal que lo diga un demócrata como yo, pero es evidente que las estructuras de inteligencia funcionan mejor en estados no democráticos, ¿no? El caso de la superestructura rusa, hoy liderada evidentemente por Vladimir Putin, pues efectivamente estructuralmente es un modelo similar al de los Estados Unidos, con multitud de estructuras de inteligencia especializadas organizadas en una superestructura, pero en este caso el control por parte de los ciudadanos a través de sus representantes es más que cuestionable. No hay nada más que ver y recordar hace unos días el rapapolvo, la humillación pública a la que fue sometido el líder, el jefe del Servicio de Inteligencia Exterior del SVR de la Federación Rusa frente al concepto de soberanía en Ucrania que se daba en ese mismo momento, ¿no? Vladimir Putin cuestionándole públicamente en el Consejo Nacional de Seguridad sobre sus opciones, que evidentemente si no han visto el vídeo les invito a que lo hagan para que vean esta falta que creo yo de transparencia y de normalidad democrática en la gestión de los usos, ¿no? De las estructuras de inteligencia. Bien, centrándonos ya en la guerra de Vietnam, disculpen la contextualización que he creído que era más que necesaria para entender qué se va a desarrollar en la guerra de Vietnam en términos de inteligencia, puesto que es muy importante saber que estamos en esa fase de evolución de estructuras simples de carácter militar, de carácter sociopolítico, ¿no? A superestructuras de carácter general, ¿no? Como tenemos hoy en día. La guerra de Vietnam es un ejemplo, es uno de aquellos pasos. La guerra de Vietnam que supongo que mis colegas profundizarán muchísimo más de lo que voy a hacer yo en el término en sí, en el concepto de la guerra de Vietnam. Es uno más, quiero decir, de esos terribles conflictos que se produjeron en el mundo tras la Segunda Guerra Mundial en atención a los procesos de descolonización. En esos procesos de descolonización, que es lo que experimenta a partir de 1947 Vietnam, digamos que se ven implicadas las fuerzas enfrentadas claramente en este proceso de bloques global que hemos venido llamando Guerra Fría, ¿no? Un campo especial y magnífico para la expansión de ese socialismo soviético, de esa idea general del comunismo que se tenía tras la muerte, evidentemente, de Stalin, o final de Stalin y la transición a Nikita Khrushchev. Evidentemente, esta idea de aprovechar la descolonización para expandir las sociedades socialistas va a generar ese proceso que les he dicho antes al principio de guerra diferida, ¿no? En esta idea, bueno, pues el conflicto que se desata desde el primer momento en Vietnam, en lo que era Indochina, ¿no? Con la multiplicidad de territorios aspirantes a crear un Estado, ¿no? Aquí tienen pues todas las posiciones y al final cómo se soluciona esto, ¿no? Que acaba solucionándose básicamente con la creación de teóricamente 4 estados, ¿no? Que son Laos, Camboya, Vietnam del Norte y el Imperio de Anán, ¿no? Posteriormente Vietnam del Sur tras el golpe de Estado del general Ngo Dinh Diem, ¿no? Entonces, básicamente el fracaso, yo creo que evidente, de tanto Francia como Japón y también el Reino Unido en implantar modelos occidentales, modelos capitalistas y democráticos, según había ocurrido en Europa, se habían implantado con el desarrollo del Plan Marshall. Bueno, pues genera una situación muy complicada y es la aparición de un Estado comunista en el norte y la pretensión de unificar los dos territorios, lo que era el Imperio de Anán y con el emperador Bao Dai, en un único Estado, quería decir, en un único Estado claramente socialista, ¿no? De hecho, había planificado un referéndum de unificación en 1958. De ahí el golpe de Estado propiciado, ¿no? Influido en esa política de guerra diferida de que les hablaba antes por parte de la Central de Inteligencia, en apoyo a este general, ¿no? Para establecer un modelo férreo capitalista que impida la progresión y sobre todo la expansión de ese modelo de comunismo tan peculiar que había triunfado ya en China con sus peculiaridades y que tenía ese apoyo Vietnam del Norte, el éxito del Viet Minh y luego obviamente la aparición del Viet Cong, del que hablaré luego un poquito más, ¿no? En líneas generales, por tanto, en esta situación donde se va a acabar implicando directamente los Estados Unidos, donde aparece este golpe de Estado, principalmente con el objetivo o la idea de frenar ese efecto dominó, teoría del dominó que les he citado con anterioridad, donde evidentemente el miedo a que la implantación de un modelo socialista en la región provocara que en Camboya y en Laos y luego pues evidentemente en el resto de esa zona del Oriente Asiático, pues del Extremo Oriente provocara una expansión o un triunfo del modelo socialista en torno a Japón, ¿no? Sería socializar, ¿no? Completamente Asia, ¿no? Por tanto, esa lucha clave y básica en la que se traduce la Guerra Fría, pues digamos que conduce a este proceso de lucha dentro de Vietnam del Sur para, en esa guerra civil, que bueno, ya he dicho que mis colegas van a explicar mucho mejor, con más profundidad que yo, pues acaba implicándose los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Debido a la implantación de esas diferentes objetivos o misiones de Vietnam del Norte en este territorio, ¿no? Bueno, pues en torno a estos líderes que son los que van en un principio a afrontar el conflicto bélico, Ho Chi Minh, Brezhnev, por supuesto Ngo Dinh Diem y el presidente Lyndon B. Johnson, bueno, pues se desarrolla esta guerra, este conflicto que va a durar, pues como han dicho tanto el general Swan como David, bueno, va a durar casi 20 años fijo, pero podemos hablar hasta de 30 y 35 años, ¿no?, de conflicto catastrófico, tanto para los Estados Unidos como sobre todo para todos los habitantes de aquella zona del sureste asiático, ¿no? Bueno, en términos de inteligencia, perdón, ya me centro en lo que es lo mío, o en lo que ha de ser mi aportación en este seminario, que espero no extenderme mucho más. Las estructuras de inteligencia que van a participar o que van a verse implicadas de forma directa, o que yo creo y estimo que hay que estudiar desde un punto de vista modélico en el proceso de gestión y captación de la información, o de implicación y participación de las estructuras de inteligencia en un conflicto bélico como fue aquel tan complejo, ¿no? Pues por un lado tenemos a la Central de Inteligencia, a la CIA estadounidense, centrada básicamente en labores de contrainteligencia, el Departamento de Inteligencia de Vietnam del Norte, en especial mucho interés a la sección A22, de la cual hablaremos ahora un poquito, y por supuesto la labor de inteligencia militar que desarrolla el KGB, que yo creo que es más interesante que las cuestiones de contrainteligencia, ¿no? También habría que hablar de la participación, indudablemente, de británicos en la zona, pero sobre todo de China, ¿no? El papel de China en el proceso bélico, aunque yo creo que no tanto en las cuestiones de inteligencia, ¿de acuerdo? A ver, que cambio de diapositiva. Aquí está. Bueno, estas estructuras de inteligencia, no me atrevería a llamarlas superestructuras porque en el fondo todavía no lo son, puesto que se deberían integrar en una estructura superior, ¿no? El KGB liderado por Yuri Andropov, el Departamento de Inteligencia de Vietnam del Norte de Dao Phu Quoc, y por supuesto la CIA liderada por Richard Helms. No me gustaría decir el mando único, pero el principio de ese concepto, ¿no?, de mando único, yo creo que a posteriori a la guerra de Vietnam o de los últimos años del conflicto en Vietnam. En lo que se refiere a la estructura de inteligencia vietnamita, bueno, yo les diría que hay o hubo 3 líneas de trabajo, 3 líneas de implicación o de esfuerzo colectivo por parte de esta estructura de inteligencia. Una estructura de inteligencia obviamente bastante poco desarrollada en cuanto a los medios, me refiero. Nunca olvidemos que era Vietnam del Norte, por mucho apoyo que tuviese de China y del KGB, pero las capacidades y las posibilidades de desarrollo de una estructura de inteligencia en un estado, en un nuevo estado, y además muy poco desarrollado y muy poco anclado en el tiempo e interrelacionado con otras estructuras de inteligencia afines en cuestiones político-ideológicas, pues nos hace ver, en teoría, la magnitud de aquella estructura de inteligencia de gran éxito, por otra parte, en lo que se refiere al desarrollo de la guerra de Vietnam. 3 caminos, 3 líneas son esenciales para comprender el proceso, el desarrollo y la participación de la inteligencia norvietnamita en la guerra de Vietnam. Por un lado, la infiltración en el medio político, esto es evidente, ¿no? No nos olvidemos, Vietnam del Norte, Vietnam del Sur, estamos hablando evidentemente de una misma estructura social, es una misma sociedad con diferentes posicionamientos o puntos de partida ideológicos. Es decir, el proceso de infiltración, tanto en el medio rural como en el medio político, no debía resultar complicado, o no imposible, quiero decir, para el Departamento de Inteligencia, de la División de Inteligencia, del Departamento de Inteligencia de Vietnam del Norte, ¿no? En lo que se refiere a los 2 campos de infiltración, la infiltración en el medio político, esto es decir, en la estructura política decisoria de Vietnam del Sur, liderada por el general Ngo Dinh Diem, quedó encomendada a la unidad A22, ahora hablaremos un poquito de ello, ¿no? El otro punto de infiltración en el medio rural que es importantísimo es lo desarrolla el Vietcong, ¿no? Ese proceso de infiltración en el medio rural, no olvidemos que Vietnam es una sociedad esencialmente agrícola, sustentada por el sector primario, y además con una fuerza muy importante del ámbito del entorno rural. Es muy difícil comprender Vietnam en aquellos momentos como una sociedad urbana. Por tanto, la infiltración dentro de ese territorio en base a elementos que se unen a estas comunidades rurales, introduciendo o buscando el apoyo y la sensibilidad hacia la causa norvietnamita de esos campesinos de Vietnam del Sur, creo que es uno de los grandes éxitos del Vietcong y que provocó una de las respuestas más, no sé si efectivas, pero por lo menos más interesantes de las estructuras de inteligencia de los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Era uno de los campos de combate, ¿de acuerdo? El tercer punto era frenar, el tercer punto era expandir el ejército popular de Vietnam del Norte por todo el territorio, de Vietnam del Sur. Es decir, buscar puntos de entrada en Vietnam del Sur desde fuera, desde fuera, bien utilizando puertos y accesos marítimos a Vietnam del Sur, lo cual es harto complicado, sobre todo a partir de la presencia militar de los Estados Unidos, o a través de otros países como eran Laos y Camboya, es decir, a través como verán después, de la llamada ruta Ho Chi Minh, ¿no? Es decir, perdón, este proceso de infiltración de unidades militares, esta ruta de comunicación que permitía la múltiple penetración en diversos puntos del territorio de Vietnam del Sur, de las tropas que formaban el Ejército Popular de Vietnam del Norte, es una de los éxitos de aquella estructura de inteligencia norvietnamita, ¿no? A nadie se le escapa la capacidad de búsqueda de puntos, sobre todo de esconder o poder ocultar aquellos movimientos de tropa. Ya sé que en términos geográficos y topográficos, Vietnam, la península, ¿no? La península de Camboya, Vietnam, Camboya, Laos, permitían movimientos de tropa casi a cubierto, pero bueno, ahora veremos cómo se desarrollan otro tipo de técnicas para impedir esto, ¿no? Pero básicamente fue uno de los esfuerzos de la inteligencia militar, en este caso norvietnamita, más importante. El proceso de infiltración a nivel político, que el líder de la estructura de inteligencia norvietnamita, Dao Phuc Loc, encomienda, entre otros muchos, entre otros, porque no son muchos, a Vu Ngoc Na, consiguen infiltrar, penetrar de forma efectiva esos círculos de poder. De hecho, Vu Ngoc Na llegó incluso al círculo más elevado, es decir, a la conexión directa con el dictador, ¿no? Es algo sorprendente, ¿no? Cómo pudieron penetrar, no sé si decir sorprendente, es sorprendente desde el punto de vista del historiador, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista, por ejemplo, del periodista que conocía aquella situación política, cómo funcionaba el gobierno dictatorial de Ngo Dinh Diem, bueno, pues evidentemente ese tipo de estructuras políticas no democráticas, dictatoriales, donde miembros de un círculo muy reducido, generalmente con conexiones familiares, dirigen el país, donde la confianza puede ser traicionada o impostada de un modo sencillo por agentes que sean válidos y hábiles para este tipo de acción ofensiva, bueno, pues es lógico que acabarán por ser penetrados. De hecho, el caso de Vu Ngoc Na es sorprendente, ¿no? Porque ya muy tarde en el proceso bélico es cuando es descubierto como agente infiltrado, perdón, y fue encarcelado, pero de hecho no fue ejecutado, quizás con la sensación o el pensamiento por parte de las autoridades survietnamitas y probablemente de las estructuras de inteligencia de los Estados Unidos, de la CIA, de que cabía la posibilidad de doblar a este agente infiltrado en el gobierno vietnamita, cosa que no consiguieron, ¿no? Cuando Vietnam del Norte ocupa todo el territorio y llega al sur, llega a la capital, llega a Saigón, Vu Ngoc Na es liberado y de hecho se le consideró hasta su fallecimiento hace unos pocos años como un héroe de la nación, ¿no? No como un padre de la patria, pero sí como un héroe, ¿no? de la constitución del Vietnam actual, ¿no? Por tanto, muy interesante el proceso de infiltración, ¿no? El proceso de infiltración que nos llevaría a discutir o debatir acerca de cómo desarrollar estructuras de contrainteligencia que impidan este tipo de infiltraciones hasta ese nivel, hasta el nivel más alto del proceso de toma de decisiones de la dictadura de Vietnam del Sur, ¿no? Lo mismo que decir con la ruta Ho Chi Minh, ¿no? Este proceso de movimiento de tropas al amparo de la geografía, pero también de la cierta colaboración, tanto de Laos como Camboya, o por supuesto a través de la inteligencia generada por aquella estructura militar donde no me cabe duda de la participación del KGB en este caso, ¿no? En lo que se refiere a los Estados Unidos, a las estructuras de inteligencia allí presentes, sobre todo en lo que se refiere a la central de inteligencia y sus actividades, frente a estos tres puntos por los que había de luchar o debía defender o debía de contrarrestar la acción norvietnamita, la estructura de inteligencia estadounidense, bueno, pues me refiero evidentemente a la ruta Ho Chi Minh, a la infiltración política, tanto política como rural, liderada por el Vietcong. Bueno, pues yo creo que es evidente que se desarrollan dos líneas de actuación, ¿no? Por un lado, el apoyo y desarrollo de operaciones militares que permitieran la ubicación o el descubrimiento de aquellos lugares de aparición en Vietnam del Sur del Ejército Popular de Vietnam del Norte, es decir, contrarrestar el flujo de tropas que suponía la ruta Ho Chi Minh. Para ello, la estructura de inteligencia de los Estados Unidos desarrolló evidentemente operaciones que condujeran a la identificación de esos movimientos de tropa. Me estoy refiriendo evidentemente al desarrollo al máximo nivel tecnológico de la inteligencia de imágenes, ¿no? Frente a ello, o para conseguir ese recurso que permitiera ubicar y descubrir aquellas posiciones donde, donde las tropas norvietnamitas estaban accediendo al territorio de Vietnam del Sur, pues se desarrollaron programas como el Oscar o el Corona, que generaron pues aviones espía de ultimísima generación, como fue el SR-71, o satélites que desarrollaron una capacidad fotográfica que permitiera igualmente descubrir esos posicionamientos, esos movimientos de tropa que en esa jungla resultaban tan complicados y ante los cuales los procesos de las operaciones militares, de las que vuelvo a repetir, mis colegas hablarán, de bombardeos sistemáticos y masivos, no resultaron tan efectivas como se esperó en un momento, ¿no? En fin, así el SR-71 y el Discover, que son dos de los recursos de inteligencia de imágenes más importantes que se desarrollan durante la guerra de Vietnam, pues obviamente si no tuvieron un éxito rotundo en esta guerra, sí habrían de ser absolutamente básicos para enfrentamientos y situaciones conflictivas posteriores donde se vio implicada la inteligencia de los Estados Unidos. Respecto al otro tipo de acciones que desarrollan la estructura de inteligencia, son operaciones distintas a la guerra, ¿no? Que es como se suelen llamar en terminología de inteligencia. Aquellas operaciones sobre el campo no de batalla, pero sí sobre el terreno, que se desarrollan y que nada tienen que ver, no quiero decir que nada tienen que ver, sino que no son directamente acciones militares, sino que son acciones que se pueden considerar paramilitares, pero que no tienen como objetivo una operación o un parte de una estrategia de carácter militar, sino que más bien vienen a eliminar esos procesos de infiltración rural e infiltración política que desarrollaba Vietnam del Norte, desestabilizando, por un lado, el sistema político survietnamita y, por otro lado, asentando la presencia o el dominio o la expansión del modelo político-social de Vietnam del Norte, que favorecía, por otra parte, la infiltración de unidades militares del Ejército Popular de Vietnam del Norte a través de la ruta Ho Chi Minh, ¿no? Esas operaciones, evidentemente, son operaciones de contrainteligencia. Yo creo que la más significativa, de la que hablaré en breves momentos, fue el programa Phoenix, ¿no? Voy a cambiar, eso es, ¿no? Es cierto que desde 1965, ya el 67, se desarrollan otro tipo de políticas previas o coetáneas, ¿no?, a estas acciones de inteligencia o acciones desarrolladas por las estructuras de inteligencia estadounidenses, que son diferentes, ¿no?, a estas acciones directas a las que me he referido, ¿no?, al desarrollo de inteligencia de imagen no suficientemente capaz para detectar movimientos de tropas o a operaciones contra la inteligencia, de contrainteligencia o contrainsurgencia, ¿no?, frente a la acción de infiltración norvietnamita. Un ejemplo es el programa Accords, ¿no?, de 1967, donde el objetivo esencial, como ven en esta diapositiva planteado, es la lucha contra la insurgencia, contra la transformación de la sociedad survietnamita en sociedad norvietnamita, que es básicamente ese objetivo, a través de un proceso de pacificación. No nos olvidemos que la dictadura del general Ngo Dinh Diem tenía procesos represivos tremendos, sobre todo, además de carácter religioso. No nos olvidemos que este general era cristiano y desarrolló políticas de persecución, incluso religiosas, en el entorno rural, lo que provocaba un claro cambio de bando o asunción de que el modelo norvietnamita era el apropiado, ¿no? Pues de ahí deviene estas políticas que fomentaban en el programa Accords el desarrollo rural, la implementación de las condiciones de vida de aquellos campesinos vietnamitas, survietnamitas, que a través de la pacificación, como decía, el desarrollo rural impidiera ese trasvase en masa de la sociedad rural de Vietnam del Sur a sociedad de Vietnam del Norte, ¿no?, más allá de una cuestión ideológica, una cuestión de defensa, ¿no?, de la identidad nacional y sobre todo de las condiciones de vida, ¿no? No obstante, cabe señalar como uno de los programas más interesantes desarrollados por la inteligencia de Estados Unidos como el programa Phoenix, ¿no? El programa Phoenix...
Disculpa, quedarían 5 minutos.
Y termino ya, me quedan 5 minutos. De verdad que me queda una diapositiva más, David, y termino. Bien, como les decía, el programa Phoenix, el objetivo esencial era eliminar, identificar, localizar y eliminar a esos elementos infiltrados en el entorno rural, ese Vietcong sumergido, ¿no?, que existía en el entorno rural. Son esas medidas de contrainsurgencia que les he avisado antes, que desarrolló la CIA y que tuvo como éxito, no sé si decir éxito, tuvo como resultado la neutralización de más de 80.000 elementos norvietnamitas infiltrados. Es interesante que este programa Phoenix fue un espacio primigenio para la aparición de los SEAL, porque los boinas verdes ya existían como tales, o también de la aparición, que luego no volvió a utilizarse, ¿no?, de los comandos, ¿no?, de asistencia militar en Vietnam, de la CIA, es decir, en lugar de utilizar unidades militares para desarrollar operaciones oscuras, operaciones clandestinas contra elementos insurgentes, la CIA desarrolló una unidad propia no de infiltración, sino de acción militar sobre el terreno, ¿no? Yo creo que es algo que luego, evidentemente, desistió por el cambio de tendencia política, ¿no? Para finalizar, por tanto, desde el punto de vista de la inteligencia, las enseñanzas que tiene la guerra de Vietnam en la inteligencia, específicamente en la inteligencia estadounidense, pero yo creo que la guerra de Vietnam, con sus éxitos y sus fracasos, es como decimos en España, un aviso a navegantes, ¿no? Por un lado, la doctrina Nixon, que es lo que se impone al final, es decir, la participación indirecta, esa guerra diferida en la cual Estados Unidos participa pero no participa, en la cual apoyas pero no apoyas, es decir, no estás presencialmente allí, en base a formaciones y isolamiento. ¿Cuántas veces Estados Unidos ha hecho, después de la guerra de Vietnam, ha hecho esto en otros tantos países, ¿no? Por supuesto, el desarrollo de acciones diferidas, como les decía, tanto para la desinformación o el control del engaño y la provocación de generar informaciones o inteligencias equivocadas en las entidades antagonistas. Por supuesto, evidentemente, el desarrollo de la contrainteligencia, de la contrainsurgencia, de esas operaciones diferentes a la guerra y la expansión o el desarrollo tecnológico brutal al que somete la estructura de inteligencia, las superestructuras de inteligencia estadounidenses con el desarrollo de la inteligencia de imágenes, más allá de la inteligencia de señales, que había sido el punto de vanguardia en el desarrollo tecnológico hasta la llegada de la Guerra Fría y sobre todo de estas guerras diferidas, ¿no? Por último, la consecuencia final, que yo creo que sigue siendo una cuestión debatible y difícilmente alcanzable en estas grandes superestructuras, es la unificación del mando en inteligencia. Con unificación no me refiero estrictamente a que una sola persona tome decisiones o sea la cabeza de los posibles éxitos de inteligencia, más bien algo colegiado, pero sí que haya una institución o una instancia superior que aglutine todos los procesos de inteligencia que he venido refiriendo. A eso tienden las estructuras de inteligencia en la actualidad. El problema es la estructura de inteligencia, la superestructura de inteligencia en un entorno claramente político, donde la inteligencia, siempre tengo la misma duda, es un argumento para defender los intereses de la nación, de la sociedad que lo financia y a quien protege, o se convierten en un argumento de carácter político. La guerra de Afganistán, desde el punto de vista soviético, y la siguiente guerra de Irak, yo creo que son ámbitos donde debatir este cuestionamiento del mando único. Bueno, yo creo que con esto ya termino. Pido disculpas si me he pasado de tiempo, pero bueno, espero que haya sido lo suficientemente claro para aportar, ¿no?, este punto de vista de la formación de estructuras de inteligencia a través de la guerra de Vietnam. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Eduardo, por tu participación, por tu ponencia, realmente muy interesante en esa visión, análisis y reflexión de las estructuras de inteligencia desde la Guerra Fría y sobre todo durante la Guerra de Vietnam. Así que muchas gracias siempre por tu participación y por tu gran ponencia. Gracias, Eduardo.
Muchas gracias. Un placer.
So now we turn our next speaker, Dr. Kirkland Bateman. He's a Chief Academic Officer, Expeditionary Warfare School, Marine Corps University, and his talk will be about the siege of the Khe Sanh and Marine involvement in Vietnam. So, Dr. Kirkland, welcome to this event and this amazing seminar, and the audience is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides, or do I need to?
I can listen very well, but your slide, no yet.
All right, let me just get that squared away here. Let's see if this works. How about now? Can you see my slides now?
No yet.
All right.
Maybe with the option, share the screen.
Yeah, I thought I was doing that. Okay, how about now?
No.
And have an iPad as an extended display. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. General Swan and David, thank you for the opportunity to participate and present on the siege of Khe Sanh. It's a real honor for me to join you all virtually, though I must admit I would much rather be doing this in person in Madrid, maybe next year. So before I get into the remarks itself, I have to offer this disclaimer that my remarks here today represent my own views. As a scholar and researcher, they are in no way representative of the Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. And I want to acknowledge that much of what I'm presenting is based on the work of Greg Jones. He's a journalist and a pretty prominent Vietnam scholar, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his two big works really are The Last Stand at Khe Sanh, The Marines' Finest Hour in Vietnam, which he published in 2014, and then a related article in Proceedings, the Naval Institute's magazine, the article titled Marines tenacious stand that came out in 2018 on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Khe Sanh. So before I get into the details of it, and of course our previous speaker was really focused on the strategic level, I'm going to take us really down to the tactical aspects of what occurred at this one battle over the course of 2 to 3 months. But there are some strategic and operational aspects of it as well. So as Greg Jones calls it, the Marines' tenacious stand is in January, February, March, and April of 1968. And 68 was really a turning point in the American war in Vietnam. During the first few months of that year, along with the battle for the Citadel at Hue, Americans were just transfixed by the confrontation between U.S. and North Vietnamese Army forces at this remote Marine combat base in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam called Khe Sanh. And indeed, a real turning point for the war from an American perspective. And so by mid-February, during the most uncertain time of the war, deepest uncertainty of the battle, President Johnson and General Westmoreland even considered using tactical nuclear weapons to try to defeat the North Vietnamese. And that would have been just a horrific tragedy had that happened. Unfortunately, it did not. But Americans had been dying at Khe Sanh as early as 1964, and they would continue to die there long after the siege was declared over in early April of 68. The hill fights at Khe Sanh in the spring of 67 cost the lives of more than 150 U.S. Marines and introduced Americans to terrain features known as Hill 881 North or 881 South and Hill 861. And I'll show those a little bit later on some maps that I have to share on the battle itself. And you see there at the end of this slide, a quote from that article from Greg Jones: "The outnumbered defenders of Khe Sanh beat back repeated attacks and withstood continued shelling in defense of the isolated combat base and nearby hills." So with that, let's continue on. And one of the first things to consider when analyzing and looking at the Battle of Khe Sanh is that the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French garrison that was defeated in spring of 1954, really figures prominently in how American leadership, both political and military, considered Khe Sanh itself. There are a lot of similarities between the two battlefields. You see sort of this garrison or airfield area that is surrounded by high ground, which when you look at it, on the terrain, you wonder why would you pick that place without being able to defend the high ground in detail. So both Johnson and Westmoreland are really committed to holding on to Khe Sanh at really any cost. And the crushing defeat, as I mentioned, of the French garrison 14 years earlier factored really heavily in the resolve to hold on to it. But despite all that, the battle still remains sort of an enigma. We're now, 54 years away from when the battle occurred, and there's really no final battle that took place or firefight, if you will, and Westmoreland's determination to hold on to it being essential. It didn't really matter. American forces abandoned it, just a few months later. And so it figures prominently in American culture and history. As you see there at the bottom, a quote from Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA song came out in 1984. "I had a brother at Khe Sanh fighting off the Viet Cong. They're still there, he's all gone." But for war critics and news correspondents, Khe Sanh was really a metaphor for the Vietnam War's strategic folly and tactical deception. In the end, over 6,000 U.S. Marines were forced to defend it, this very isolated base up in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam. Westmoreland said it was indispensable. We had to have it. And then, of course, after upwards of 1,000 Americans died trying to hold on to that piece of terrain, we left it. So with that sort of as an introduction, let's get into a little bit more detail. I wanted to orient you on where the battle took place geographically, and I'm going to try to use some pointers here and pin options. So obviously, we all know that Vietnam is part of the Indochina Peninsula, and at the time it split into North and South Vietnam. The DMZ at the time is right about there. Khe Sanh is just, is less than about 25 miles south of the DMZ. And in the middle map with Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam highlighted in different colors, you can see where Khe Sanh is located in that regard. Why go there? Well, it's the importance of it was related primarily to trying to interdict North Vietnamese forces coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And on the map on the far right, the area that's highlighted in all this red is really the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where communist North Vietnamese forces were able to move through Laos and Cambodia in order to come back to the east into South Vietnam with reinforcements and supplies, food, water, ammunition, and weapon systems and what have you. And then in a little more detail, back over here on the left, you'll see the DMZ in detail here, that area. And again, Khe Sanh, the Khe Sanh base is located right there. So really, 25 miles or so, and you see how close it is to the Laotian border right here. Highway 9 or Route 9 that I'm tracing figures prominently in the siege and the relief of the siege itself. And it's important also for the North Vietnamese because the Ho Chi Minh Trail intersects that route on several places, and they use that to great effect. So that's kind of where the village and Khe Sanh itself is located in the broader area of the Indochina Peninsula, and then Vietnam, South Vietnam in particular, and its relation to the DMZ. So let's get into a little more detail. The base itself, as it looked in 1968. And so on the map on the far left, you see again a little more clearly how the Ho Chi Minh Trail that I'm tracing, and you see in red, that the North Vietnamese army is able to use to great effect by moving reinforcements, supplies, what have you, down the trail in Laos, and then at specific points can come back into either North or South Vietnam. And so for the purposes of the map there, that's kind of where I'm drawing a circle around the dot. That's kind of where Khe Sanh, the combat base, is located. So a very critical point in terms of holding that terrain if your focus was interdicting North Vietnamese forces as they were trying to reinforce and come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now let's move to the map in the bottom center so you can see a little more detail. There's the combat base. There's the village of Khe Sanh, the village of Long Bay, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the Special Forces, Army Special Forces camp. But the hills that I talked about earlier, you see 81 North, 81 South, and 861. Those are sort of the main areas that Marine forces in particular were defending as outposts in order to protect the base itself. And you see the base on the far right-hand side map with the orientation that, this bottom part of the runway is basically facing west, as you see with the compass rose right here. And then to the east is to the top of that. But, this is much more of a garrison-like atmosphere, similar to what was at Dien Bien Phu with the French garrison. So you needed to have your combat forces in security defensive outposts, which we talk about in that center lower map, in order to protect the garrison with the airfield and all the facilities related to running and managing that airfield, as well as the different forces and their headquarters that were located inside the base itself. So I think that should give you a decent orientation on where the combat base and the village of Khe Sanh were located, and sort of the importance of the hills that we'll hear later when we talk about Hill 881 North, 881 South, and 861. So with that, let's kind of get into the battle itself. The Battle of Khe Sanh occurs over 4 distinct operations. Most folks are familiar primarily with the siege itself, but that was just one of the 4 different elements. So you really have to think about the Battle of Khe Sanh almost more like a campaign than a single distinct battle. So the first operation was Operation Scotland, and that took place from November 1st, 1967 to March 31st, 1968. General Westmoreland had sent the 26th Marine Regiment, so a force of about 3,000 plus Marine infantry and associated combat and combat support enabling forces to reinforce the Khe Sanh combat base. That brought the total number of troops to the base at around 6,000. The Marines stockpiled ammunition, refurbished the airstrip, and all sort of in preparation for a possible North Vietnamese attack to seize Vietnam's northernmost regions and to put the U.S. in a stronger position prior to any future peace negotiations. And then a third goal that I've spoken about earlier was to interdict North Vietnamese forces as they're trying to resupply and reinforce their forces further to the south. The second operation is what we know specifically as the siege, which took place January 20th, 21st is when it started. And it lasted for 77 days until the Marines were relieved and the siege was broken on April 6th of 1968. The North Vietnamese attacked Marines along Hill 861 and the Hoang Ho district headquarters at Khe Sanh village itself. The fighting over those 77 days had periods of real intensity. The defenders involved included, in addition to the Marines, South Vietnamese militia, as well as U.S. Army advisors and the Marines that we already talked about. They would be there really until the first week of April, when the 1st Air Cavalry Cav Division of the U.S. Army is able to break through the siege and relieve them. So the third operation, Operation Niagara, began on April 14th, 1968. It was a joint U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps air campaign that was in support of the Marine forces at the base. Operation Niagara called for electronic sensors to be installed along the nearby DMZ, and reconnaissance flights then to pinpoint enemy targets. It also included upwards of 24,000 tactical fighter bomber sorties and nearly 3,000 B-52 strategic bombing sorties. And then lastly, the fourth operation was known as Operation Pegasus, and it occurred from April 1st to April 15th of 1968. This was the relief operation. with elements of 1st and 3rd Marine regiments attacking up Route 9 towards Khe Sanh, with the 1st Air Cav moving by helicopter to seize key terrain features. As the Marines advanced, engineers repaired the road on Route 9, and ultimately they were able to relieve the Marines that have been under siege for those 77 days. And then lastly, Operation Scotland 2, sort of a continuance of the previous one, began the day that Pegasus ended and lasted until July 11th. So the Battle of Khe Sanh really comes to an end in mid-July for most of the historians that are studying it. And as you see there at the bottom, when it's over, nearly 1,000 U.S. dead and thousands of Vietnamese had stained the soil of Khe Sanh. So the battle's broken into the actual siege. We're going to break into about 4 different elements. The first one is the early fighting element to it. And so, by mid-January 68, remember the siege itself begins on the 20th overnight into the 21st. Marines and Special Forces Green Berets have been scouring the area around Khe Sanh combat base for North Vietnamese. Of course, they've been there, as I said earlier, since November, December timeframe. The enemy's first blow fell on Hill 861, which is right there, highlighting in the map in the middle upper portion of the slide. And it was occupied by Kilo Company of 3rd Battalion, 26 Marines. In the early hours of 21 January, North Vietnamese forces pounded the hill with artillery, rockets, mortars, and followed by a battalion-sized infantry assault that penetrated the hill's northwest perimeter. Heavy weapons ravaged the Kilo Command Group, seriously wounding the company commander and first sergeant and killing the gunnery sergeant for the company. The Marines sealed the breach as supporting fire from Khe Sanh Combat Base and Hill 881 to the south. Here's 881, and then the combat base itself were able to reinforce with fires to keep Kilo Company from being overrun. And then 3 miles south, in the village of Khe Sanh, American and South Vietnamese advisors were at the government's Hoang Ho district headquarters. They were fighting for their lives, really. The compound's defenders, which was just a 4-man U.S. Army advisory team, about 20 Marines of a combined action company, about 75 Bru tribal militiamen, and 70 Army of the Republic of Vietnam officers. So really not much more than a reinforced company, had to hold off repeated attacks of a regiment, the 66th North Vietnamese Regiment. And the following day, the compound defenders withdrew to the combat base. So they withdrew out of the village up to the base itself. And unfortunately had to leave behind the bodies of 154 enemy fighters without gathering any intelligence. 12 South Vietnamese soldiers and 7 Bru militiamen died in the fighting, but no Americans. Here you see this picture here is one of the bunkers on Hill 861. This picture is also from Hill 861. The far right is an aerial view of the base itself and the airstrip. This direction is west. So the bottom of the photograph and where the runway begins or landing takes place is to the west. And then over in the bottom left, just to get an idea too of what it looked like from a aerial photography view, this is what we've been talking about, Hill 861. And you see the airstrip in the upper left, the fortified Hill 861 itself, and then this was 861 Alpha, the support base. So just to give you an idea of how things actually looked on the ground. The terrain itself is, this is the very mountainous part of Vietnam, and what we call triple canopy jungle. So the ground itself was pretty clear because the triple canopy of trees really didn't allow enough sunlight for any ground vegetation to grow. So different than the jungles further to the south in Vietnam. So this is sort of the early fighting. The next one to talk about is the intensification, sort of how the fighting intensifies. So in the days that followed, North Vietnamese artillery, rockets and mortar rounds rained down on the Khe Sanh combat base and its outposts, the different hills that I've mentioned before, and you can see in that map in the upper left of the slide. Snipers were a constant threat. After nightfall, North Vietnamese soldiers would probe the Marine defenses. Enemy fire took a mounting toll, and in an all too typical tragedy, an NVA rocket streaked in from the west on the afternoon of 24 January and smashed into crude bunkers occupied by Marines of Bravo Company 3rd Recon Battalion. Acts of valor became commonplace, really. And on January 26th, so at this point, 5 to 6 days into the siege itself, an artillery forward observer with Kilo Company on Hill 861 was tracking a 2-squad patrol of the recently arrived 2nd Platoon Alpha Company. And as the patrol worked its way into a draw up the western slope of 861, really, so right here, the forward observer saw 2 groups of NVA soldiers emerge from hiding and fire on the Marines. One Marine stood up and advanced toward a concealed enemy machine gun, pumping rounds from his grenade launcher. And rather than drop to the ground to reload, the Marine kept advancing and firing until an enemy bullet struck him in the head. That fallen grenadier was Private First Class Dwight Tommy Denning, who'd been in Vietnam barely 2 months. The beginning of the communist Tet Offensive, which occurs, really just 10 days after the siege at Khe Sanh, only heightens the concerns in General Westmoreland's headquarters and in Washington, D.C., with Johnson and President Johnson and his advisors, that Khe Sanh would confront this massive ground attack requiring, just an extraordinary amount of intervention. And so on February 1st, General Earl Wheeler, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, sends a eyes-only cable to General Westmoreland, and Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, who's the commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, and asks whether or not tactical nuclear weapons might be needed to save Khe Sanh. Westmoreland expressed confidence that he could defend the base, but he didn't rule this out, and is quoted as saying, I visualize that either tactical nuclear weapons or chemical agents would be active candidates for employment. So that alone, I think, is a real window into the mindset of how policymakers in the government and military leadership were thinking about Khe Sanh. So against this, this real very anxious backdrop, the North Vietnamese continue to attack. They launch a series of ground assaults on Khe Sanh's outer defenses. Again, we talked about the ring of hills, 881 North and 881 South and 861. And shortly after 4 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of February, explosions and gunfire raked recently established outposts on 861 Alpha, which is just right there, just to the southeast and west. Or excuse me, it's off the northeastern flank. It's up in here. As soon as this initial barrage subsided, enemy sappers poured through the gap in the northern perimeter. And the Echo Company commander, Captain Earl Breeding, deployed fire teams to a new line forming behind the shattered northern perimeter and calls in fire support. Inside the outpost itself, the Marine counterattack shored up the northern perimeter and was able to hold off a final desperate assault by the North Vietnamese. In the end, Echo Company loses 33 men killed and wounded, which is nearly 1/5 of the company's total strength, but they still held on to Hill 861. The next part of the battle to consider is the attack at Long Vay. So Long Vay is this village to the west of Khe Sanh and the base, and it's near where an Army Special Forces camp was located. So I just drew a circle around it for you in that map in the upper left. And the pictures that you see on this slide, I'll go through as I talk about each one. And here's a little more detail. The Special Forces camp, this map up here, that you can see in a little more detail where the actual attack took place. So on the morning of February 6th, the North Vietnamese Army fired mortars into the Long Vay compound, a 5th Special Forces group of the U.S. Army and an Indigenous Civilian and Regular Defense Corps location. North Vietnamese infantry were backed by 11 Soviet-made PT-76 light armored tanks, which is this vehicle right here. It was also called an amphibious tank because it could swim in relatively calm seas. So light tanks overran the Army Special Forces camp in the village of Long Vay, just southwest of the combat base. On these two aerial photographs, you see destroyed PT-76 tanks. So this is the same photograph, just a different view of it. The last holdouts, 8 Americans and about 15 South Vietnamese, withdrew to the camp's underground tactical operations center. And when the enemy threatened to blow up that reinforced concrete bunker, the South Vietnamese fled outside. Presumably they were shot and killed. Then around dawn the next day on 7 February, the North Vietnamese blew a hole in one of the bunker's walls. This was kind of the emblematic of the bunkers in the Special Forces camp. And by 7:45, they were on the verge of overwhelming the Green Berets inside. At the last possible moment, a pair of A-1H Sky Raiders, which is this aircraft here. So unlike a lot of the other aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft in Vietnam that were attackers or bombers that were jets, the A-1H was a prop driven, so it could get much lower, and it was at a slower speed and more maneuverable, and in many ways much more suited to ground combat support from the air. They were deployed off the USS Coral Sea, carrier vessel number 40, carrier fixed wing attack 43, which is out in the South China Sea at the time, penetrated a sucker hole. So anyway, the overcast clouds, they were able to get through, and they made a series of life-saving sorties that really prevented the North Vietnamese from overrunning the Special Forces soldiers in the camp. More attack Squadron 25 Sky Raiders arrived and broke the communist attack with cluster bombs and napalm. 17 of the 24 Green Berets who had been stationed would survive the attack, including 3 who were captured. The 3 that were captured would remain in North Vietnamese custody until 1973. 7 were killed in action or missing, including Sergeant Eugene Ashley, who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his efforts to save his trapped comrades in the command bunker. The fighting southwest of Khe Sanh would continue on 8 February when the North Vietnamese attacked in the pre-dawn hours, nearly overrunning a platoon-size outpost on Hill 6-4, which is in this area here. The survivors held on until daylight when their company commander led a relief force to the hill. 27 Americans died in the fighting, including the platoon commander. The hill and surrounding terrain were littered with nearly 150 North Vietnamese dead. The next thing to consider really was the logistics of the siege itself, because it became apparent very quickly that without reinforcement and resupply, the Marines at Khe Sanh were going to be overrun. And the ability to resupply Khe Sanh posed a significant problem, for the American forces. More than 6 months earlier, convoys to the base had been discontinued because North Vietnamese ambushes along Route 9, leaving only supply by air. But on 10 February, so just a little more than, not quite 2 weeks into this, or almost 3 weeks into the siege itself, 8 Americans died after Marine KC-130 transport was hit by enemy fire on its approach to the airstrip and burst into flames after crash landing. That is the photograph of the actual aircraft in the aftermath of trying to put the fire out and rescue the crew, but they were unable to do that. So the resupply burden then shifts to the more nimble C-123 transports, which is this aircraft, and then helicopters, primarily the Marine CH-46 Sea Knight. There's a picture of one with a sling load, probably of either ammunition or rations. The North Vietnamese sent 2 divisions to attack, and they had now virtually encircled the combat base. U.S. fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. So these are A4 Skyhawks in both pictures. And then that's a UH-1 attack helicopter. At the bottom, you see aerial rocket pod on the side of the helicopter. Faced both the fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters faced a gauntlet of fire on their Khe Sanh runs. Despite their efforts, the base reported a staggering supply shortfall of nearly 1,200 tons by the 19th of February. On the hill outposts, rations and water allocations were cut, and wounded men sometimes died as they waited for medevac missions that never came. So in order to alleviate the problem, the 1st Marine Air Wing devised a large-scale helicopter resupply tactic. On the 24th of February, Operation Sierra, better known as the Super Gaggle, was launched. 14 Marine A4 Skyhawk jets, which I showed you those photographs in the upper right of the slide, blanketed suspected NVA anti-aircraft positions around Hill 881 South with high explosives, napalm, tear gas, and smoke. And then immediately afterward, 8 CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters dangling cargo nets, which you see in the center of the slide, packed with ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, arrived and were escorted in by UH-1 Echo helicopter gunships, which you see there in the bottom right of the slide. The Sea Knights were able to swoop in, drop their cargo nets, and replenish Marines on 881 South with 24,000 pounds of needed supplies. Almost overnight, Khe San's resupply crisis eased, but the grueling fighting continued for nearly 2 more months. So some of the heaviest fighting occurs now with the ambush and assault that takes place. On February 25th, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, 2 of their platoons, 1st and 3rd, are trapped in a nasty ambush. These are some of the pictures of those platoons during and immediately after the ambush. The next morning, their platoon commander led 3rd Platoon outside the southeast perimeter of the combat base in search of enemy tunnels and trenches. Before the patrol reached its second checkpoint, 3 NVA soldiers jumped from cover and ran along an access road before ducking into a tree line. Overruling the warning of its squad leaders, platoon commander led his entire platoon into an L-shaped ambush. Platoon commander was mortally wounded within minutes. The patrol disintegrated. Stunned and injured survivors trickled back to the combat base through the late morning and afternoon. Fewer than half of the 40 men returned from what became known as the Ghost Patrol. And still the fighting continues. So the bloody end of the siege itself stretches into its 3rd month. On 29 February, a Marine CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter that's flying from Dong Ho, which is to the east of Khe San, was hit by automatic weapons fire and crashed. There's the helicopter that is on fire. Unfortunately, all 23 Americans on board were killed. On 6 March, an Air Force C-123, so those lighter transport planes that replaced the C-130s, it crashed as it was trying to land at Khe San on the 6th of March after taking enemy fire, and was killed. All 49 aboard were killed. Depleted by U.S. fire and troop diversions, the North Vietnamese mounted a final desperate assault on the eastern perimeter in the early hours of 18 March. The light of day revealed another 83 North Vietnamese dead. The following evening in the United States, on Sunday, March 31st, President Johnson offered to ease the U.S. bombing campaign against the North in exchange for peace negotiations. And a stunning finale, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. As the president spoke, Operation Pegasus, which you see the maps of it here at the bottom, which is the relief operation, initiated to reopen the land link to Khe San from the east. 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, and 1st Marines, 2 regiments, both the 1st Marine Regiment and 3rd Marines, supported by South Vietnamese airborne forces, pushed westward from Route 1 toward Khe San. On 8 April, the official link-up between Pegasus forces and Marines at Khe San occurred. General Westmoreland declared the siege of Khe San lifted, and the media spotlight turned elsewhere in Vietnam. So with such a focus on Khe San and a very significant battle, Greg Jones calls it the finest hour or the finest battle for the Marines in Vietnam. Why Khe San and sort of at what cost? Well, as I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, really the 3 overall objectives were to counter NVA attempts to seize the northernmost regions of South Vietnam, interdict the supply efforts along Ho Chi Minh Trail, and try to achieve a stronger position for any future peace negotiations. But it came at a tremendous cost. U.S. casualties across all the services for the entirety of the operation were nearly 1,000, and North Vietnamese casualties, upwards of 5,500. So Khe Sanh, kind of slips from the headlines in the nightly news, but the fighting and dying continues for 3 more months. The U.S. forces abandoned the base on 11 July 1968. And so it really begs the question of a lot of unanswered questions about the battle itself. There's a harsh verdict on Khe Sanh has taken hold over time. Some of the literature on the Vietnam War includes Stanley Karnow in his bestseller in 1983, Vietnam: A History. He declared Khe Sanh a fiasco for the Americans. And his verdict was further amplified by Neil Sheehan in his 1988 book, A Bright Shining Light, John Paul Van in America and Vietnam, where Sheehan wrote dismissively that the siege was a ruse to distract Westmoreland while the real blow was prepared. A real blow being on the urban areas in Hue and other cities in Vietnam for the Tet Offensive. And Khe Sanh revisionism has largely ignored the impact of the extraordinary firepower that was brought to bear on North Vietnam, on the North Vietnamese forces. So between 22 January and 31 March, the U.S. Air Force and Marine aircraft conducted over 24,000 tactical strikes against communist forces around Khe Sanh, in tandem with nearly 3,000 B-52 missions under Operation Arclight. Some Khe Sanh scholars believe the massive close air support campaign, Operation Niagara, that I talked about at the beginning of my remarks, combined with artillery fire, thwarted and broke large-scale ground attacks at Khe Sanh. So that begs we have these questions then, like, who won? If the North Vietnamese never took Khe Sanh, does that mean that American forces won? Or if we ultimately abandoned Khe Sanh, did that mean we lost? Were the North Vietnamese really serious about taking the base in the first place, or were they drawing forces away from the Tet Offensive, as Neil Sheehan in his book asserts? And was General Westmoreland duped by the NVA commander into thinking that this was going to be another Dien Bien Phu? And was he haunted by that? In 1966, so just 2 years before the Battle of Khe Sanh, the book Hell in a Very Small Place by Bernard Fall was published about the French experience at Dien Bien Phu. And so certainly military commanders and policymakers and others had read that book. It was only a year and a half to 2 years old by this point. So I believe that it figured prominently in the planners and how they thought about the defense of Khe Sanh. Certainly, Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive weighed heavily on American perception of the war. And as I said earlier, 1968 is a real turning point for the American war in Vietnam. And even though it took us another 5 years before the war ended, by 68, I believe that the decision's already made. It's just a matter of time before we can get to actually executing it. And certainly, it was a tremendous propaganda victory for the North Vietnamese, being able to ultimately make U.S. forces leave Khe Sanh. Ultimately, gaps in our knowledge that result from Hanoi's secrecy still to this day ensure that the North Vietnamese objectives at Khe Sanh will remain subject of ongoing debate. Lien Hong Nguyen, a Columbian University scholar, has said that they being North Vietnam, has released so much on the decision making in 1967, but the minute you get to the failures of 1968, they haven't revealed as much. And so the contention is that much of what we know about North Vietnamese objectives with respect to Khe Sanh is just conjecture until more of the Communist Party archives are opened. And then lastly, as historians, it's important for us to consider what lessons are available to learn about the things that we study. We shouldn't just study history for the sake of studying it and learning about historical facts, but we should consider how can we think about ways that what happened might have been done differently or could be done differently in future types of situations. So I've just sketched out a few here related to Khe Sanh. So certainly combined arms warfare and multi-domain operations are critical. Without the overwhelming firepower, both from land, from artillery, and from air-based assets, the Marines and other forces at Khe Sanh never would have been able to be successful in withdrawal. And then other multi-domain operations, certainly military operations in the information warfare occurred, intelligence, logistics, sustainment was key. So all those things have to be done in combination. The next one that, just because you're in the defense doesn't mean that you're not going to have to conduct offensive operations. And over time during the siege, the Marines got better and better at that, conducting security patrols and reconnaissance to keep the forces in the defense informed and secure. Over and over again, small unit leadership is vital, and it's critical to what success occurs on the battlefield. Certainly, logistics has to be accounted for during the planning process. It can't be an afterthought, which is what occurred at Khe Sanh. It needs to be accounted for during the planning process, and in many ways will represent a constraint on what actually can be planned and executed. The value of joint and multinational operations certainly then is just as true now. We are never going to do anything by ourselves, whether it's the US or any other ally or partner. And so we have to continually train in joint and multinational operations to be proficient. And then lastly, we always have to be cognizant of the role of public opinion. And even though Khe Sanh was executed largely at the tactical level, it certainly had strategic and operational impacts. And that is also true today. That happens just as much. With that concludes my remarks. I appreciate everyone's time listening to me and thinking about Khe Sanh and how it fit in the broader American experience in the Vietnam War, and especially that critical, pivotal year of 1968. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bayman. Thank you, because it was a really great presentation, interesting and unique approach to the Marines' involvement in Vietnam. Thank you very much. So we are receiving so many questions, many compliments to the event through the chat. I invite to everyone to continue to ask your question, and we'll select some, our final day today, in the question section. So, David, damos inicio a nuestro siguiente ponente.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Vamos a pasar a presentar al siguiente ponente, en este caso, la profesora Marie Ploux. Nous passons maintenant à notre prochain intervenant, Marie Ploux, professeure d'histoire militaire à la chaire de tactique et d'histoire militaire du Centre de doctrine et d'enseignement du commandement. Et sa conférence est portée sur des biens fous, résistance désespérée d'un camp retranché français. Marie, tu peux commencer quand tu veux.
Hello, my name is Marie Ploux. I'm currently a professor at military history at the French Army's Centers for Doctrine and Leadership Teaching. It is located in Paris at the École Militaire. My presentation in today's seminar will tackle the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, its context, and the political and strategic elements that lead to this defeat. So this defeat of the French army, which started on the 13th of March and ended on May the 7th, still resonates in the national imaginations as a Waterloo of the 20th century, and still feeds fantasies of all origins. This battle was marked and shaped the minds of generations of soldiers through the dramatic return of the survivors of the Viet Minh detention camp. This is why this tragic event deserves better than only fantasies that distort the reality of heroic resistance of the French contingent in Indochina. Dien Bien Phu is an inexhaustible source of thought for military leaders. This is a rare case in points regarding judgment and combat reasoning. It is also the perfect illustration of the main principle of tactical and strategic actions. This famous battle in the history of the French army reflects the values embodied by military leaders and highlights the importance of having an adapted structure of command to conduct operations in face of a particular adversary. While this battle is more than an example, 2 points will be the subject of this study. The first will tackle the principle of war, and the second, the sublimation of the soldier's ethics, something deeply anchored in the soul of any officer. Before starting the analysis of this battle, it is necessary to set the context as a whole. The defeat of Dien Bien Phu came at a critical moment in post-war international relationships and at a time when France went through several phases of political crisis. The redeployment of French forces in Indochina took place in 1945, after the short but very violent occupation of the peninsula by Japan. General de Gaulle had anticipated this need upon his arrival at the head of the Free French, even before the liberation. Its objective was to establish the authority of the French Empire throughout the Indochinese peninsula in order to gradually grant the French possessions more autonomy and, one day, independence. In 1946, insurrection broke out in Tonkin. It opposed French colonial troops and rebel whom, under the leadership of the Viet Minh and its leader Ho Chi Minh, set ablaze Indochina. The Viet Minh soon controlled most of the countryside and villages. However, General Leclerc managed to reconquer partially the country, but the defense of Indochina was increasingly difficult. The situation worsened when Mao Zedong took control of the China, enabling Ho Chi Minh to have both a rear base and substantial armed support. It then became possible for him to set up large-scale operations in the north and the delta of the peninsula, both occupied by French forces. In front of this difficulty, the French government called out Général de Lattre de Tassigny, who, by his charisma and his military genius, restored a situation considered as lost. Sent to Indochina with little assets, in December 1950, Général de Lattre de Tassigny rectified the situation in just a few battles. He successively took Bignane, Dong Trieu, Mao Kei, Ninh Binh, and the Day River, securing the strategic corridor that was the key to the gate of Hanoi. He constantly alternated between offensive and defensive actions. He was finally replaced by General Raoul Salan. Salan had been almost permanently present in Indochina since 1945 and knew the country perfectly. Furthermore, he knew what he was able to get from his men and his resources. Through his tactical mastery, General Salan sublimated the principle of economy of forces. He detached, moved, and maneuvered his troops until he got around Viet Minh forces, jostling them by his tempo and finally fixing them. However, these advantages were not enough to answer the long-term tactical superiority of French forces. Indeed, the Viet Minh People armies, led by General Giap, was getting stronger every day with the help of Chinese communists. In 1953, the balance of power was finally reversed under the tactical pressure of Viet Minh units reinforced by artillery. Drawing on its experience in Nassan, the French Expeditionary High Command decided to provoke a direct confrontation with the most experienced Viet Minh divisions, hoping to win a decisive victory before the opening of the peace conference in Geneva at the end of April 1944. So, why this failure? Did the geopolitical context preempt the French defeat? Is it the leader's fault, the poor planification, or a combination of these elements? What lesson can we still learn from this 68-year-old battle that took place deep in Southeast Asia, on the borders of Vietnam and Laos? Could Dien Bien Phu reflect the dichotomy between military heroism and political issues? So, spring 1952. Giap's strategy showed his willingness to shift his effort from the western Indochina to the Upper Tonkin region on Laos. His goals were to attract French forces in an unfavorable situation far from their support base, to isolate the French Vietnamese forces from northern and southern Indochina, and to inflict psychological failure on France, thanks to a groundbreaking defeat. However, his strategy lacked the fire support needed on the ground because the Viet Minh had no anti-aircraft artillery and heavy no 105 mm guns. October 1952. Salan intended to find a way to counter the attacks of the 308th, 312th, 316th Viet Minh divisions with a system of attrition defense. His goal was to withdraw all French combat posts from the Black River Upper region to Nassan Crossroad regrouping area. The commander's intent was to break the successive waves of assault into a network of support points established on a double defensive belt around the air track. He also intended to maintain his freedom of action by keeping 3 battalions as an operational quick reaction force. Indeed, he knew that his ability to reconquer the positions seized by the enemy was the key to deny the Viet Minh progression. This tight defense of the entrenched camp demonstrated the ingenuity of the French tactical choice. It was a life-size taste of using an air-land-based concept to control large free spaces far from the Delta region. After the Nassan victory, Salan saw in this new defensive concept the possibility of transforming the layout of the Tonkin Delta. The concept created a triangle of identical defensive bases, enabling a significant air effort to be deployed from the airfield of Nassan, Dien Bien Phu, and Lai Chau. Thus, in March and April 1953, the effectiveness of the concept was demonstrated with at least 15 battalions fixed in Nassan and Lai Chau. Thereby, all massive Viet Minh offensive in the direction of Laos was denied. After the victory at Nassan and the setup of Salan's archipelago, the general was replaced by General Navarre on May the 27th, 1953. Dien Bien Phu became a major issue for both adversaries. Strategies and engagement of forces opposed each other. So, General Salan was replaced by General Henri Navarre. He ignored the current situation in China and had no assigned political war goal. He inherited Salan's archipelago with no clear understanding of the importance of the whole layout defense mechanism. The strategies were gradually balancing out and the overall evolution worried the High Command. The initiative had to be taken again and a new campaign plan had to be set. With no guidance from a constantly changing government, he developed a comprehensive strategy based on what he learned from a 1-month tour on the field. He therefore came up a 3-phase plan. Phase 1, protect the delta and the Hanoi-Haiphong axis. Phase 2, defend Central and Southern Annam to prevent Indochina from being cut in half. And phase 3, defend Laos, the weakest point of the Indochinese Confederation, where the Viet Minh made its effort. Therefore, in the end, General Navar decided to combine phases 1 and 3 into a single maneuver. For the Commander-in-Chief, time had to be gained in order to create a powerful Indo-Chinese army by significantly increasing the ratio of local troops, and set up the most favorable conditions to start political negotiations that would preserve the French presence. From the Viet Minh point of view, General Giap and Ho Chi Minh decided to act together on the French critical vulnerabilities of its four centers of gravity. At the international level, the weakness of the French position. At the national level, at first the indifference and later the hostility of the French public opinion. At the strategic level, the undermining of the French self-confidence by a massive engagement in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And at the tactical level, the destruction of the use of the airfield. Let's study the forces of the protagonists involved in this battle. French expeditionary forces. The troops were mainly composed of French soldiers and soldiers of the Empire, Algerian, Moroccans, Indochinese, etc., led by young French officers, volunteers, or conscripts. Their morale was high, and the troops were experienced, veterans, serene, courageous, convinced of their legitimacy. As of Dien Bien Phu, on the 13th of March, the garrison peaked at 10,000 men, later to be reinforced by 4,000 men, for a grand total of 50,693 forces. Viet Minh forces. The Viet Minh attacked Dien Bien Phu on the 13th of March, and by launching the first assaults against the Gabriel and Beatrice combat posts. General Giap engaged the divisions 304, 308, 312, 316, and 351 for a total of 33 battalions. The Heavy Division 351 was composed of 5 engineers, field artillery, heavy weapons, and anti-aircraft artillery regiments. With all its reinforcements, we can assume that General Giap had more than 100,000 men, including more than 60,000 regular combatants in uniform. At Dien Bien Phu, the French commander-in-chief relied on advantages taken for granted. The French army was extremely able to maneuver and attack. Dien Bien Phu used as an offensive base, it allowed the CAF to both fix and pursue the enemy in the region. The enemy anti-aircraft artillery was not able to completely cancel air superiority. And the multi-point support system of Dien Bien Phu was as effective as Nha San to block the overwhelming Viet Minh assaults, due to the fact that Dien Bien Phu was largely wider than Nha San. Unfortunately, one of the major mistakes was an underestimation of enemy forces. The French headquarters believed that the Viet Minh had no artillery or was not able to use it. However, it already had these capacities. It thought that the enemy had no anti-aircraft artillery, but it did, and when this information was known, the commander-in-chief and his staff did not consider it. The Viet Minh was considered on its own. However, Soviet and Chinese advisors accompanied them, and some deserted from the French army, served some heavy weapons. The terrains at Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is a large valley surrounded by mountains. It is an endless succession of sinuous roads bordered by large tropical forests. The whole territory was favorable to guerrilla actions and was considered as an area of insecurity. The French Expeditionary Force feared the night due to the lack of air support and therefore the increased risk of Viet Minh attacks. I will now move on a strategic tool for the French High Command. I will list a few points, but if you want more information, you can ask questions after the conference. So, the government did not provide any guidance to the High Command of the French Expeditionary Force. As a result, when the Viet Minh 316th Division started its movement toward Laos, the French army was forced to prioritize the defense of this country after evacuating Nha San. In response to this threat, Operation Castor was launched on the 20th of November. The purpose of this operation was to cover Luang Prabang by deploying 4,500 men in Dien Bien Phu. The commander's intent was to settle a political and military base of operations to intervene in the region, as well as disturbing Viet Minh movement in the area. However, facing a very difficult strategic choices, General Navarre made the following mistakes, which weakened the French Expeditionary Force in Dien Bien Phu. Poor analysis of the importance of the Nha San layout, loss of freedom of action and no concentration of efforts, isolation of the entrenched camp resulting in the reduction of the freedom of action, lack of alternative solutions in the plan of maneuver, and political and strategic military divorce. I explain this point. Contradiction between the government and the High Command compromise the freedom of action of the Commander-in-Chief. On the one hand, with no clear defense directive, General Navarre chose a defensive strategy. On the other hand, French policy didn't fully assume its responsibilities and allowed a strategic failure to occur by addressing the fate of Indochina at an international conference in Geneva. Indeed, on the 18th of February, the official announcement of this conference placed Dien Bien Phu at the center of the game. General Giap perfectly understood the stakes and was willing to sacrifice everything to destroy the notoriety of the French Expeditionary Force. That's why he decided to reorient the 308th divisions toward Dien Bien Phu. Because of this conference's terrible timing, General Navarre was trapped. The defeat of Dien Bien Phu was certainly dramatic on both tactical and operational levels, but the strategic and political consequences were much more critical due to the panic of the government and the High Command, as well as the psychosis of abandonment increased by political incapacity. General Giap understood that Dien Bien Phu was a strategic objective as early as the end of November 1953. Therefore, it became the main target of its tactical intent. He wanted to force the French Vietnamese troops to fight far from their main bases. It was a huge risk because it was necessary to increase the military capacities of its own troops in short time. It also implied a massive mobilization of the population and a brutal acceleration of the Chinese material and equipment aid. General Giap had to face two challenges: logistic, to build or renovate 50 kilometers of tracks and 18 kilometers of roads, and artillery. The failure of Nha San highlights the need for the Viet Minh to receive Chinese guns and to place them around the entrenched camp. General Giap trapped his opponent and didn't want to let him escape. All French offensive before the battle failed to breach the encirclement and resulted in the evacuation of Lai Chau. This garrison was supposed to reinforce Dien Bien Phu, and all Thai auxiliaries were massacred. Few lucky survivors from mobile groups and commandos managed to escape while the camp was burning. The initial strategy was effective and meaningful, and the determination of the soldiers was of master importance. Unfortunately, the strategic choices of the High Command and the lack of government support considerably weakened the military capabilities. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap took advantage of this situation. After having studied the context and the strategies, we can see the battle in a few minutes. So, in 3 days, from the 13th to 15th of March 1954, General Giap denied the French troops the use, the airfields, and settled the fate of the battle. The French High Command failed to consider the importance of this objective, and the entrenched camp was condemned from the second day on. The airdrop and the sacrifice of the parachuted reinforcements would only contribute to delay the inevitable. The rest was only heroism. As the battle unfolded day and night, under permanent artillery fires for 57 days, the French Vietnamese forces fought with a fierce determination and an unbelievable fighting spirit and fierceness. Finally, the most heroic dimension of the battle was completely embodied by the 1,500 volunteers who decided to jump on the camp and to give their life for their comrades. Who were these thousands of young soldiers who died for France in Dien Bien Phu? Paratroopers, legionaries, tirailleurs, gendarmes, sailors, aviators, doctors, nurses, whether they were colonial or metropolitan, all died for France. They are all anonymous heroes who fell with honor on a track, in the mud, in the jungle, or in a Viet Minh prison camp. The Ministry of Defense, to honor these heroes, listed them on the Mémoire des Hommes website. There you will realize the huge sacrifice of the French Expeditionary Corps. During these conflicts, politics had an important impact on the operations. Indeed, the conference in Geneva, which started on the 26th of April, changed the nature of the battle. Geneva turned Dien Bien Phu into a strategic objective. Concretely, and because of such a poor timing, France committed a political suicide, subjecting this conference during the Berlin Conference. General Giap understood clearly the stakes of this conference. According to French intelligence, he quickly decided to postpone the beginning of the battle, initially planned on the 25th of January. And for Ho Chi Minh, it was absolutely essential that the battle followed the diplomatic tempo. This concordance with the international calendar could explain a tactical mystery. Why didn't General Giap choose to annihilate the French heavy artillery at the start of the battle despite its weaknesses and of its delaying role in the Dien Bien Phu base's defeats? One hypothesis could be that the Viet Minh High Command decided to conquer the entrenched camp step by step in order to totally achieve the conquest during the conference. With this strategy and by accepting huge losses as well as internal controversies, General Giap would have created the conditions for an epic battle with an apotheosis taking place at the most critical political moment. Finally, for General Giap, it was just a matter of patience and the perfect combination of time and force. Despite this defeat of Dien Bien Phu, General Navarre self-control temporarily stopped both the threat on Laos and the risk of being surrounded in the Mekong River Delta region. Moreover, the French moral forces increased after the battle. Only the notoriety of the French army was impacted, even though less than 5% of the French expeditionary force were lost in this battle. Finally, Dien Bien Phu was a tactical defeat, but not a decisive one for France in Indochina. Dien Bien Phu is still a source of reflection and a benchmark. All these soldiers went beyond what is humanly possible. By their sacrifice, the French army left Tonkin better but with honor. The force of the military heroism counterbalanced the distraction of French international and internal policy. General Giap's strength was to adapt his strategy on the two fronts, the political and the military ones. This dissociation on the French side caused the separation between the political and the military. Vietnam and France fought even-handed. The first won and the second lost. The Vietnamese succeeded thanks to their tactical, strategic, and political unity, while the French failed by an accumulation of tactical, strategic, and political mistakes and dissonance. With no political guidance and a big political instability, the French forces were not able to defeat their enemy. Therefore, beyond his personal mistakes, General Navarre was the scapegoat of an unstable political system. And it is not certain that a victory in Dien Bien Phu would have deeply changed the history. Perhaps it would have delayed the loss of Indochina, but no more. To conclude, Dien Bien Phu is a reference to study. Indeed, it illustrates the importance of key factors in planning and operational management. Nowadays, the defeat at Dien Bien Phu still resonates as a desperate battle in a surrounding camp, and whenever a unit faces such a similar situation, the name of Dien Bien Phu instantly comes to one's mind. That was the case in 1968, when the USMC base of Kishan was cut off and faced the risk of being overrun during several months. General Westmoreland, back then, even spoke a Dien Bien Phu in reverse, thanks to a more favorable outcome. Muchas gracias. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Marie, pour votre intervention et pour la présentation. Pour la présentation de la bataille de Dien Bien Phu. Et à la fin de la journée, s'il y a des questions pour Marie, et pour répondre à la fin de la présentation. Merci beaucoup, Marie, pour votre intervention.
Je vous en prie.
So now we are going to take a 10 minutes break and come back with other next presentation. So see you in 10 minutes. So welcome again to this amazing seminar, The Vietnam War. Right now, we turn to our next speaker, Dr. Tyler White, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Nebraska. And his talk will be on American military intelligence in the Vietnam War. So, Dr. Tyler, welcome to this amazing event, and the audience is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone at INISEG again for having me to talk about intelligence in the Vietnam War. I'm going to take a bit of a liberty and switch it more from military to strategic intelligence, and I'll talk about what I want to present on here in a minute. But what I do want to say before I do that is, I do come from a different generation of folks. My father's generation were the ones that fought in Vietnam, and I've spent time in Vietnam. In about 2007, I went there with a group of students, and I found the country to be an absolutely amazing place with amazing people. We were treated so well and warmly, even as Americans. But it is humbling to see the scars that the war left behind. The good news is that the resilience of the Vietnamese people is pretty amazing. If you get a chance to go, I highly recommend it. And it's always been interesting comparing my experiences in Vietnam with that of American Vietnam veterans, and I've had a lot of conversations with them. It's just so amazing to me that our recollections can be so different, and it really does show that that time changes things. So I want to I want to talk today a bit about, if I can get this up. I want to. Can you see the? Am I sharing the right one?
No yet. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So what I want to talk about today are the key assumptions of why we went to fight in Vietnam. And I want to talk about that from the perspective of using structured analysis, which is something that I teach. And I think that it's all about asking the right questions. And it sort of amazes me that we don't do that more often. And my hope is that we are in a place now where we are asking the right questions more often. But I want to start with this quick video from Robert McNamara, who's one of those rare sort of historical figures who really does reverse course in a lot of ways. He was one of the architects of the Vietnam War, but he becomes very retrospective towards the end of his life. And I think it's worth hearing what he has to say real quick.
We don't have audio.
Can you hear the the audio?
No.
Oh, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me just tell you what he says. He basically says that the U.S. misunderstood what the war was all about, and upon reflection and upon himself going to Vietnam, being able to speak with some of the people who are on the other side of the equation, that the Americans, we didn't necessarily do a good job of understanding the nature of the adversary. That this was not a war about communist expansion the way we thought it was. It was a war about national unity in a lot of different ways. McNamara writes a book later on, a reflection about Vietnam. One of the things he says is, we just didn't have a very good understanding of the region, and we were operating on some really basic assumptions that this was a launching point for communism, that people like Ho Chi Minh were dedicated communists, and that preserving South Vietnam would be similar to preserving South Korea. And looking back upon it, a lot of those assertions were wrong. And I do have to say, having been to Vietnam, it's kind of amazing. You walk around and there's a McDonald's and there's a Starbucks and there's the open markets and so on and so forth. And you think to yourself, who really won this war? It wasn't that the Vietnamese today really reflect a love of communism, but that it was a part of a broader context, and maybe one that led us down a path that made us see things that weren't necessarily there. Whoops. So what do we want to do with this presentation? I just want to spend a little bit of time with you asking some of those deeper questions. I want to try to understand more clearly how the United States understood its opposition in Vietnam. And I want to use estimate of products like the National Intelligence Estimate, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, to try to pull out some of the key assumptions that were guiding U.S. decision making. If you go back and you look, there were about 174 estimated products between 1948 and 1975 on Vietnam. And because time has passed, the CIA has actually declassified a large number of these products. You can pull them off of the internet. I spent a lot of time with them, looking through them and looking for the way that the CIA was characterizing the situation in Vietnam. And what I want to do is apply a really rudimentary key assumptions check, which is a structured analytic technique. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to walk you through it a little bit to try to get at some of the key assumptions that the U.S. used to motivate its policy in Vietnam. What I do for this, though, is I only use facts that were knowable at the time. Right now, we have a really good, much better sense, as McNamara points out in that clip, of what the reality was. And remember, intelligence is one of those things where we're trying our very best to get as close to reality as we can so that decision makers can make better decisions. And then what I do is, after I sort of run through this key assumptions check, I want to sort of summarize the findings and highlight some of the key themes about U.S. intervention in Vietnam. So what's a national intelligence estimate? A national intelligence estimate, or NIE, is a representation of the thinking of the U.S. intelligence community on a specific subject. So some of the more famous NIEs that have come out are the NIE on Iraq weapons of mass destruction, right? But it's an analysis that's collected from the broader intelligence community. Certainly, for most of the time, the NIE was heavily dependent on the Central Intelligence Agency. It still really is today. but it does collect from a bunch of the different intelligence agencies kind of their bottom line key judgments about a selected topic. The NIEs are distributed by the National Intelligence Board, which coordinates the different outputs from the different agencies. This is something that is run through the DNI. So traditionally, or I guess formerly, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency would produce this, but today it's the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that does this. And these are supposed to be, again, the common wisdom or the best analytical bottom lines that the IC has to produce. And this is given to senior decision makers to help them better understand what's going on. So this can go to the senators, it can go to the Joint Chiefs. It'll probably, the number one customer is the President of the United States. These things can be lengthy and compiled over time, or they can be the result of an urgent request. You want the lengthy one compiled over time because you get a lot more time to think about this. So the NIE on climate change, for example, is one that really takes a look at long-term analytic thinking and uses that as the basis for writing the report. The NIE on Iraq WMD was more hastily composed. It was kind of composed. I mean, certainly they would reach back for older analysis to try to ground their analysis in a longer timeline. But the NIE on Iraq weapons of mass destruction was requested kind of between 9/11 and the war in Iraq in 2003, at the beginning of 2003. So not a lot of time there to put it together. So I have this picture because, everybody loves Rocky IV. And I think that Rocky IV in a lot of ways personifies, right, the way that Americans saw themselves in the Cold War. Americans see themselves as the underdog, constantly having to deal with this giant, monolithic, overpowering, overbearing communist threat. And that was kind of a key assumption made throughout the Cold War. Our ideas about the nature of the conflict in Vietnam really were reflected in these key estimative products. So if you go back and look at 174 products, which again, not all of them are publicly available, but a lot of them are publicly available, and you look at the key assumptions that are being made, almost unquestionably, they fit this narrative. They sort of fit the Rocky versus Drago narrative of there being a much bigger, more coherent communist threat. And that threat being, looking to encroach just about every single level around the world. And it is important to highlight here that American reasoning for going to war is varied and it does evolve over time. There are a lot of reasons that the US states and a lot of different decision makers over time who lay out reasons for why deepening engagement in Vietnam was something that we thought was necessary. This goes all the way back to Truman, but it goes through Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. They not only talk about communism, which I'm going to pull out here in just a second, focus on, but they talk about, credibility, right? If the United States jumps in to defend South Vietnam, what happens if it leaves? And what does that say about U.S. credibility? And these are the exact same discussions that we continue to have today about threats throughout the world. I mean, this is something that we talked about in Afghanistan. It's probably something we're talking about with NATO and Ukraine today. So there are recurring themes here. But when you look at the NIEs, some of the things that you pull out are this development of this idea of communism, and you probably have heard of the domino theory, which is really sort of one of the guiding principles to intervention in Southeast Asia. But it's this focus on communism as a global, integrated, and persistent threat. That basically that all of these communist states somehow are united behind a single version of communism or single ideology, and that ideology is the thing that's driving state behavior, right? The next is that communists in Vietnam are supported and guided by the Soviet Union and China, that Vietnam in and of itself is part of this larger cabal of communist expansionism. The next is that the Vietnam War was part of a broader communist strategy. Other people are going to focus really on that history, and it is fascinating. I suggest you go, you not only listen to the conversations that are being had here, but read more on the history. The Vietnam conflict or war, however we want to classify it, it does evolve over time. It's not so clear cut, the way maybe South Korea or the Korean conflict was, where one country sort of invades the other. There is a guerrilla war basically happening sort of early on, and again, something worth talking about in depth, but sort of set aside here. The next one is that military intervention was necessary to defend South Vietnam, that we needed to put some skin in the game in order to secure their sovereignty. Also, that South Vietnamese sovereignty is a key U.S. national interest. Again, we see this argument even today, right? That the Ukrainian sovereignty is a part of the U.S. national interest, or Afghan sovereignty under a non-Taliban government, so on and so forth. States make these claims all the time. But sort of underneath that claim is this basic idea that if South Vietnam falls to a communist regime, other Southeast Asian states will fall too. So, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and then it just begins to spread. And there's this notion that there's no way to actually stop it. So you have to draw a line in the sand, and you have to defend this area in order to make sure that communism is contained, which goes back to Truman's sort of containment doctrine. And that the final sort of key estimative factor that I want to talk about here is that the American capability far surpassed North Vietnamese military capability. I have picked out a couple of basic themes. These are sort of guiding principles. If you go through and you look at these estimative products, you will see many more. I am not trying to say that this is definitive. I am saying that you do see these key assumptions being used in order to drive the bigger estimative analysis, right? So the things that the president is reading and the things that the people are talking about, these themes are reflected many times over in those statements. So, and lastly, I think, which is important to point out here, as McNamara states, the initial decisions to provide military aid in Indochina, they were done reflexively. They weren't necessarily done based on firsthand knowledge of the region. If we think about it this way, there were practically if there were any Vietnamese speakers working at the Central Intelligence Agency, working in the State Department, and so on and so forth. This was seen in a lot of ways as the French being unable to maintain the colony. So the United States, an ally of the French, at a really important time in sort of European politics, stepping in to help to maintain that Western influence, an anti-communist influence in Southeast Asia. So again, there were some perceptions about some very Western-driven perceptions about the role the United States should play. And if you sort of don't believe me about the key context that was coming out of the NIEs, it's stated over and over again by different leaders. Lyndon Johnson alludes to, again, some of these different reasons why we should stay in Vietnam and why we should be involved. But he says, the central lesson of our time is that the appetite of aggression is never satisfied. To withdraw from the battlefield means only to prepare for the next. And that is hinting directly at the fear of Soviet or communist expansion, that abdicating responsibility, as he saw it in South Vietnam, meant an invitation for communism to continue to spread. Eisenhower, who sort of coins the domino theory, says you have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it will fall, that it will go very quickly. So again, there's this notion of urgency in the need to defend South Vietnam from communism, because once communism wins, it continues to spread, and it spreads even more quickly. And the last one I sort of wanted to highlight was from a 1950 NIE that says communist domination of mainland South Asia Southeast Asia would not be critical to US security interests, but would have serious and immediate and direct consequences. And if you're a little confused by that, I am too, because it seems like if it has immediate and direct consequences, that it could be critical to US security interests. But you can see even in the 1950s, the US intelligence community is trying to hedge a little bit about what the spread of communism might mean in Southeast Asia. And again, remember, the key assumption here is that if South Vietnam falls, that communism will continue to spread throughout the region, and American and Western and democratic capitalist influence will be driven out, which is, fundamentally a national interest. So I think of this Ian Malcolm quote, right, from Jurassic Park, but I want to change it, right? To your politicians were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. If you go back and you look at a lot of the estimative analysis, it paints a pretty bleak picture of what the world looks like if the United States does not sort of maintain the regime in Southeast Asia or in South Vietnam. And the other thing that I think is really important to think about is, from our perspective, that one of those key assumptions is that our military is going to be able to handle and defeat the North Vietnamese military. And that's a pretty solid assumption, right? I mean, they can't muster the same kind of firepower. In Operation Bolo, for example, when Robin Olds leads a strike group of F-4s against North Vietnamese MiGs, they shoot down like a fairly large percentage of the operational MiG-21s in the theater in one day. So it's not that the North Vietnamese military can challenge the United States, but there is an assumption that that's the fight that they're going to get. So if you think about it from their perspective, they have a whole bunch of reasons to think that this is something that they can win and win fairly easily, which is why I think it's important to challenge our key assumptions, right? And it's important to challenge those assumptions over and over again. Hindsight's 2020. And we know that the basic assumptions that they made at the time were not necessarily the assumptions of, or not essentially ground truth. But what I'm suggesting is that we learn from these, as Robert McNamara said in that quote. And again, you were not unable to hear it, but the main thrust of what he's saying is we made mistakes and it's time to learn from them. Well, how do we learn from those kinds of mistakes? What kinds of things can we do? And I'm going to suggest that Vietnam really wasn't even the catalyst for this kind of change. This kind of change in the intelligence community happens later on. But when you think about the totality of the conflict itself, more than 55,000 Americans die in this conflict, but 2 million Vietnamese die in the American Vietnam War, and that's a significant chunk of their population. So the stakes are incredibly high, and when you run into a situation with a whole bunch of assumptions and the stakes are that high, it might be important to challenge those assumptions to make sure that they are solid. So structured analysis, right? I want to talk a little bit about what this is and why we have it. As I mentioned, in Vietnam, we didn't really have a lot of soul searching that went on in the same way it went on, say, post 9/11 and post Iraq WMD, or the intelligence community will also point to the Indian test of a nuclear weapon as being one of those, oh crap moments where they all of a sudden realized that whatever they were doing in terms of analysis simply wasn't cutting it because they were missing stuff. So this new thinking, I suppose, coming out of the Sherman Kent School, really focused on saying, hey, can we break down our analysis into something that people can show on paper so that it is structured in a way that you can try to check for biases and blind spots. We put a lot more focus on our own biases. Every human being is biased in one way or the other, and a lot of it just comes down to the way we, nature has built our brain. We need shortcuts. Our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the thing up here on the front that does all the critical thinking, it's really expensive to operate. And so your brain's like, are there any shortcuts available to us? Let's go ahead and take that, right? In this case, a shortcut might be, are they fighting? Well, they're communists, so this is about communism, right? And so, you know, post 9/11, post Indian nuclear test, post Iraq WMD, there was a real groundswell of support for these structured analytic techniques, which give you a schema, which give you the ability to sort of take yourself out of your own biases and your mindset and work through a problem systematically. It also focused on this idea of alternative analysis. I have a colleague who I have seen, he's a wonderful human being, and I've seen so many job talks just go south because he asks one basic question to the job candidate, and he says, how do you know if you're wrong? I've listened to your dissertation, I've listened to your presentation, how do you know if you're wrong? You know what? Very few people sit there and think to themselves, how do I know if I'm wrong? And until you can answer that question, you don't really know if you're right. And so being able to think about that other side of the coin is absolutely critical to good analysis. So dealing with bias, dealing with these blind spots, dealing with the other side of the coin is absolutely critical in making sure that your key assumptions about what is going on are actually correct. So there's a whole bunch of different structured analytic techniques, and I actually teach them, but you know, they've got these books here that that are full of these different techniques for different situations. The one I want to run here is a key assumptions check that helps us to think more deeply about the reasons that we have for going to war. These things are meant to augment and to support the broader analytical process. So they're not an end and means of in and of themselves, but they're there to get us to think differently. And sometimes thinking differently opens up new possibilities, new ideas, and sheds light on things that are otherwise hidden. So what is a key assumptions check, or a CAC, we call it sometimes? It's a structured analytic technique that focuses on looking at evidence and assumption. So really we take the key assumptions and look and find out, really ask ourselves critically, does the evidence we have support that thing, that assumption, right? We make a lot of assumptions about primary motivations. Right now, if you're watching the news, there are pundits everywhere and analysts and experts coming out talking about Putin and what he wants and why he wants it. And you'll find that there's a lot of people who have differing opinions on this, right? At the end of the day, what are they trying to do? They're trying to get at the basic assumptions that are driving his behavior. And that's a really tough thing to do. And so sometimes giving ourselves the ability to have a process that we can work through helps us to clarify our thinking. And a key assumptions check should be done on a periodic basis, just on the things that you hold to be true, because things change and sometimes new information comes along. And so consistently challenging your own assumptions is a very healthy thing to do, because the goal is to firm up our thinking and to try to expose some of the blind spots, and ultimately to stimulate new thinking on the issue. You know, I have in parentheses here, maybe avoiding or escaping quagmires. What happens when you are stuck in the same position over and over and over again? The definition, right, of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? So a key assumptions check might help us to change our behavior, change our thinking. So what's the method here? This is a picture of a very young Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh's a really interesting character. When I was in Vietnam, we could go and walk past his mausoleum, but the wait was 7 hours long just to see him. So he's still very revered in the country of Vietnam as a revolutionary. You know, he spends time in the United States washing dishes, right? He's a very smart guy who at one point, right, really thinks that the United States is probably the best partner, the anti-colonial partner that he's looking for. But if we're going to apply a key assumptions check to this, it might have shed some additional insight into who Ho Chi Minh was that we didn't necessarily incorporate into our analysis, right? So how do we do this? The first thing you have to do is you have to be open to the fact that you're wrong. This is a huge hurdle for a lot of people to clear sometimes. The second thing you have to do is write down your key assumptions. You're writing down the who, what, when, where, why, and how types of questions, right? And then you're trying to determine whether or not some of the facts that you have guiding your assumptions, are those hard facts or are those sort of squishy facts? Are those facts that that depend on context, or those facts that might depend on incomplete information. And, a lot of times our assumptions come when we're trying to bridge gaps, right? Between something we know, and how do those two things go together? Well, sometimes we fill it in with something we think we know, but we might not know that thing, right? How are we going to figure that out? So really trying to grapple with knowable facts and then apply it to your basic assumptions is the thing that we're really focused on here. So we want to critically examine those assumptions. Things like, am I confident that this assumption is correct? What are the circumstances in which this might be untrue? So there's some counterfactuals, right? Could it have been true at one point, but is no longer true today? Do I have confidence in the validity of the information that I'm getting? If it turns out to be invalid, what impact will that have? Even doing a structured self-critique where you assume, for the sake of argument, that you're wrong about this analytical bottom line. What do you think the things would have had to occur that would have made it wrong, right? Where are the weaknesses in the argument, or maybe the places where you use a heuristic or a shortcut or an assumption in order to bridge that gap? Each assumption is placed after you sort of compare the facts to the assumption. You then rate those assumptions, right? So is it a solid assumption? Is it correct but with caveats? And then those caveats can stimulate additional thinking, or is it just unsupported? And then you refine those assumptions, and then you discuss key uncertainties. I like to make a chart, and it looks like this. So I have the key assumptions that I mentioned earlier, and what I did was I went back and did, again, this is a broad 100,000-foot view. There is a lot of nitty-gritty detail, and there are some exceptions, and there's a lot of discussion to be had about the details of some of these. But from a standpoint, the key assumptions I was able to pull out of the national intelligence estimates, I put them in the key assumptions, right? So these are the key assumptions about communism in Vietnam. That communism is a global, integrated, and persistent threat, that communism in Vietnam is supported by and guided by the Soviet Union and China, that Vietnam War was a part of that broader communist strategy, and that military intervention was necessary to defend South Vietnam, that South Vietnamese sovereignty was key US national interest. If South Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian states would too. And finally, that American military capability surpasses North Vietnamese military capability. Then what I did is I went through and tried to assess it again with information that would have been knowable at the time. To some extent, you look at the first one, you say it's supported with caveats, right? Communism was considered a threat. Communist countries were aggressive, right? We can't deny that. But there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that it was integrated and persistent. In fact, we had lots of really good information. The Chinese and the Russians didn't like each other. That this ideological bond between the two came a distant second to national disagreements. We knew for a fact that Stalin really distrusted Asian communists, for example. So that might get us to think a little bit differently about the nature of the threat. The next one, that communists in Vietnam were supported and guided by the Soviet Union and China. Again, similar thing, supported with caveats. Both China and the USSR gave them material support, but there was a Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, and the North Vietnamese behavior was nationalistic and not necessarily ideological. The next one, that the Vietnam War was part of a broader communist strategy. This is sort of unsupported, right? Again, the Sino-Soviet split is really important here. And Chinese behavior and Russian behavior is much more consistent with weakening the US and not necessarily making it a win for an ideology. Military intervention was necessary. If your goal is to prop up the South Vietnamese government, then yes, you probably have to do that, because it's not clear that the South Vietnamese forces were going to be able to hold off the VC and North Vietnamese aggression. But I think you have to look at the second one to really determine whether or not you want to go to war over it, right? South Vietnamese sovereignty being a key US national interest. It's not really supported. US involvement in Southeast Asia was a result of French influence and the later desire to defeat communism there. But again, it's making a broader assumption about an ideological struggle. And the closest sort of we can get to justifying this is probably Johnson's determinations about backing away from a fight and not supporting an ally. Again, we can have a deeper discussion of that as we go through this. If South Vietnam fell to communism, other states would too. This is unsupported. We see the possibility in Laos and Cambodia, but Thailand, not really. There's a number of Philippines, not really, right? There's a number of other places in the region in which they're sort of firmly ensconced in the American sphere of influence. And then American capability far surpassed the North Vietnamese capability. That's supported. The U.S. could beat them in a set piece battle, but the problem was that's not the war that we ended up fighting. We ended up fighting a guerrilla war to which we were not well suited. So we use this as a way of jumping off and thinking about the problem more deeply, right? It raises some key uncertainties where we can ask additional questions. And remember, intelligence also is about the power of asking the question, because if you're focused more in one area than you are in another, you might miss this other area is actually really important. So a key assumptions check gives us the ability to ask questions in areas where we weren't asking questions, previously. To what extent is communist expansion even a priority? To what extent is it feasible, right? I would look for evidence linking, the communist parties together and seeing whether or not it was a driving factor in what was happening in Vietnam. I would also ask, to what extent does Russian and Chinese support for Vietnam depend on ideology? Is it really just a strategic opportunity for the Russians and the Chinese? What's the main rationale in North Vietnam? Is it communism or nationalism? And later in his life, McNamara is very, very clear on this. He says, we thought it was communism. The reality was it was nationalism. So that's a hindsight observation, but there was evidence at the time that suggested that this was a struggle for national unity, that it was actually a civil war. We should ask the question why we're supporting South Vietnam. They're not a democracy. They're not necessarily even all that popular. Are we supporting somebody who's not worth supporting? This conversation does happen later on, by the way. And then we should ask the question, is this a conventional war or something else? Because Westmoreland's attrition strategy and McNamara's attrition strategy is to try to kill as many people as they can to try to kill the resolve of the enemy. There were studies by the Rand Corporation, by the way, that come out that basically say, the enemy is not deterred by your attrition strategy. In fact, it's strengthening their resolve. So that's an important thing to think about. At the end of the day, and I'll cover these last two slides kind of quickly, but we know now that for the North Vietnamese, much of this was a struggle of independence. They saw the United States as the French, and the French left a really bad legacy in Vietnam. And the United States steps in and actually sort of replicates that. I've been to the Hanoi Hilton. We think of it as a place where they kept American POWs, but if you go there today, really what it is it was a French prison that imprisoned Vietnamese dissidents, right? And that's how they kind of remember, that's the lens through which they're seeing this. And when we look at the motivations, a lot of this was focus on national struggle, and our focus was on ideological struggle. And so those things don't necessarily line up. And it causes a great amount of frustration, particularly when you insist on fighting the war in that way. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, why does this matter? It matters because these types of intelligence failures continue to happen. They're because of blind spots and gaps in our knowledge and understanding. And sometimes intelligence is sublimated to policy preference. If we look at the Iraq War, for example, a lot of the stuff that came out in that NIE supported what the policy preference of the White House was. The state INR, they file essentially a minority report in that NIE that says, we don't think he has weapons of mass destruction, and here's why. They did a better job, you could argue, of sort of following the evidence and being willing to say the unpopular thing. But at the end of the day, when the stakes are this high, we really need to know what's going on, and we need to ask tough questions, and we need to be open to the fact that our assumptions are wrong. And if they're not wrong, then we've done the work to try to understand why they're right. And we keep challenging them over and over, because again, Iran 1979, Iraq 2003, these were big sort of intelligence failures. And if you go back and you do a forensic accounting of them, one of the things that you find is that there were a lot of assumptions that are made early on that are pulled through. When we look at it afterwards, we find out those assumptions were wrong, but it was also the basis of a lot of the decision-making that took place. So this is a really quick overview of this, but my hope is that it impresses upon you the need to think slow sometimes. We oftentimes make decisions by thinking fast, as Kahneman would say, but really challenging our basic assumptions about how we see the world, and maybe even how our adversary sees the world, can help us make better decisions, not just in the intelligence world, but in the policy world as well. And so with that, I think I am out of time, and I will somehow get this to go away. All right. Are we doing questions here or afterwards?
Yeah, after. When
Okay.
finish all the presentation, we start with the questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tyler, because it was a really great presentation, a really interesting topic on American military intelligence in the Vietnam conflict. So thank you very much. So right now, we talk with our next speaker, Erin McCoy. She is an associate professor in English and interdisciplinary studies at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, and she talked about the role of Karl Marlantes. So Erin, it's nice to see you and welcome, and the audience is all yours.
Thank you. Thank y'all for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. And yeah, let me get started. So I will share the screen with you. I am going to, since this is on the screen really quick, I'm going to show some clips from the Vietnam War. One of them I tested them, so they'll play on Zoom, but the ones I actually own would not play. So just heads up on that. So it didn't violate copyright too much. So yes, what I'm going to be talking about is the role of Karl Marlantes in the Vietnam War, the film, but he is also a veteran and a writer and things like that from 2017. So briefly, one of the things I wanted to bring to this conference, since it's got such a military bend to it, is that Karl Marlantes served in the Marine Corps. And I wanted to be clear about how he was, how the Marine Corps was involved in Vietnam from very early on is the shortest answer. And the source here is the U.S. Marine Corps University. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but Marlantes was he served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps as an infantry officer from 1968 to 1969, October to October. He's highly decorated. He received a Navy Cross, a Bronze Star, 2 Navy commendations for valor, and 2 Purple Hearts and 10 air medals, which he did some interesting things with planes as well. You wouldn't normally see those from the Marine Corps. In 1968, what the Marines were mostly involved in Vietnam would be, they call it the defining year here, but the Tet Offensive was the big push. The Marines were able to pretty much repulse all of the attacks except the ones at Hue, and they were also involved in a 77-day skirmish in Khe Sanh. And then in 1969, there was a gradual reduction of forces, but the Marines were very heavily involved in Operation Dewey Canyon, and they were also working in I Corps in that era. So just a little background there on the Marine Corps as we go forward. So the Vietnam War, the film, there is the poster for the film. So September 2017 saw the release of Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's 10-episode documentary, The Vietnam War with the Public Broadcasting System, or PBS. The film sought to act as, quote, an example of how to calmly assess episodes fraught with passion and sorrow, end quote, and aimed to help heal the innumerable wounds of war inflicted. Whether or not Burns and Novick succeeded in this endeavor remains a subject bandied about by critics and historians and of course, viewers like you. Noted Vietnam War historian Dr. Christian G. Appy posted a running commentary on the series while it aired, like on his personal website, noting that while he couldn't think of anyone who shaped modern American historical memory more persistently, prolifically, and successfully than Ken Burns, definite flaws emerged upon viewing the film. The Vietnam Veterans for Factual History, a Texas-based group made of Vietnam veterans, scholars, and historians, blasted the film in an open letter to Burns and Novick, arguing that it portrayed the U.S. support for South Vietnam as blustering, blundering jingoism, and the choice of music, graphics, and interviewees demonstrates a bias in favor of the militant leftist anti-war cliches of the 1960s. So there's 2 points of view. The Vietnam Veterans for Factual History also compiled a comprehensive transcript of the film, including how much airtime separate individuals received, as well as errors in the film's larger narrative. Counter essays take umbrage with several of what they call docutainment. Anti-war activists, however, felt that the anti-war movement was marginalized. It appears that neither side, despite the film's ethos of bringing disparate views together, felt rightfully respected. One of the main quarrels that many have with the film is that those who are featured in the film have a not so hidden anti-war agenda that many felt was, clearly being put forward. Military and diplomatic historian Mark Moyer took the documentary to task in his article, A Warped Mirror, for City Journal, writing that the filmmakers took sides on controversial issues and purposely misled the audience by leaving out context and facts. Ultimately, Moyer wrote, Burns and Novick could have achieved something close to impartial account they promised if they had included contrasting examples that supported the competing schools of thought on the war. So one example of this is that the film was very impressive in that it included North Vietnamese voices or Vietnamese voices at all. But then what it left out was the South Vietnamese voices, which is a consistent voice that's left out of Vietnam War cultural historiography and general history in many ways. So the filmmakers continued reliance further on historian Jeffrey Ward, who wrote or co-wrote the historical outlines for most of Burns' films, including the Civil War and the World War II documentary, The War. So it's questionable, of course, if you're working in the field, to think that one person can really handle writing the narratives for all of these wars. And many historians who still research focus on Vietnam could have written a more comprehensive middle ground narrative. Moyer points out in the aforementioned article that while the research for the film was robust, Burns and Novick restricted their on-camera interviews to individuals who participated in the war, leaving out historians, aside from those who were also veterans. So they played it a bit cagey there. I like the strategy, for the record, but the strategy works well in regard to the general inclusion of voices long absent from American narratives of the war. And it is undeniable that these empirical sources carry great authority and value, and veterans clearly present important perspectives on history. Their opinions and observations don't necessarily make them historians. I use veterans a lot in my own research, but I feel like it has to be balanced by other things. So I feel similarly about this film. The Vietnam War appears to be designed as a route toward understanding for those who had little to no exposure to the war. Like Burns' The War in 2007, the World War II film, this film's modus operandi is to educate its audience. What's most curious about this education, however, is whom Burns and Novick selected to teach us the lessons of Vietnam. So you see the cover photo here. It's got two people reflected. So you obviously get an automatic sort of binary image here. You've got the helicopter kind of to the distance there, which is a nod to this is the first helicopter war. This soldier, who I'm assuming is an American soldier, is carrying a weapon, but it's not like, being fired. It's at ease, so to speak. And then the Vietnamese person is, well, weapons could be there, but it's not as overt of a weapon, we might say. So the simple promotional image here tells us that war can equal weapons, and the weight of the individual who carries the weapon is the main story of the war, per Burns and Novick. So now we have Karl Merlantes. I'm going to pop this over. Less than 5 seconds into Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's documentary, after scenes of small town Veterans Day parade in the 1960s juxtaposed against images of the Vietnam War, which I'm going to play for you in a moment, the audience hears the voice of author and Vietnam War veteran Karl Merlantes, who is pictured in the two pictures. The other photo is just a stock photo of Marines in Vietnam. Merlantes he recently wrote a book in the last year or so that came out in 2019, but he's most known for his Vietnam War novel, Matterhorn. And then he also wrote a nonfiction book called What It Is Like to Go to War that is, from what I've been told from Marines, is something that it's taught sometimes in the school, which was in 2011. That book, Matterhorn, was 2010. And it attempts to explain the combat soldier's perspective on and off the battlefield. What It Is Like to Go to War reflects the bulk of Merlantes' on-screen time in this film. He appears in 7 of the 10 episodes, commenting on the war along with broader statements regarding culture and human nature. In an iTunes featurette included with the series download, Merlantes can be seen in a collaborative writing and editing session for the film. At a Q&A during the annual Texas Tech University Vietnam Center and Archive Conference a couple years ago, historian, veteran, and fellow Vietnam War film subject, James H. Wilbanks, acknowledged that he'd done close to 5 hours of interviews for the film, and we see him on screen for less than 5 minutes. So how much the filmmakers grabbed versus how much they chose to use is also something that could be its own paper. But of course, most of us are not, I am not privy to this archive of footage that they shot. Merlantes, as I said, is featured a lot, and he can tell, I think, the story of the savagery of war while still assisting the filmmakers' need to keep war, even the ones they disagree with, on a pedestal, because that's one thing that Burns and Novick consistently do, is they're very good at making it very valorful and honorific, and war is up here, so to speak. The Vietnam War might be a divisive film, but it continues to shape war into a mythical, romantic creature in the same veins as the other films that Burns and Novick have made. Click. Okay. So while Merlantes carried a few weapons in Vietnam as a first lieutenant, his primary post-war career is that of a known author in Vietnam War studies. He isn't as prominent, at least in the United States, as Tim O'Brien or Phil Caputo, both of whom appear in the film, but also you can find them in freshman English textbooks. As the first person to speak in the film, Merlantes sets the tone for the movie. He's also identified as Karl Merlantes, Marines, 1969. So his status as a veteran sets some sort of bar of authority for the film. So his final question, what happened, repeated twice, serves as the thesis for the entire documentary. So let me, come on, I gotta get out of here. Okay, and let me play that for you now. So here we go.
Coming home from Vietnam was close to as traumatic as the war itself. For years, nobody talked about Vietnam. We were friends with a young couple, and it was only after 12 years that the two wives were talking, found out that we both had been Marines in Vietnam. Never said a word about it, never mentioned it. And the whole country was like that. It was so divisive. And it's like living in a family with an alcoholic father. Shh, we don't talk about that. Our country did that with Vietnam. It's only been very recently that I think that the baby boomers are finally starting to say, what happened? What happened?
Okay, so back to here and present. Okay, so after we're hearing this bit of Marlantes, he notes that interest in the war has only been very recently a topic of conversation among the generation that came of age during the heaviest era of the war, the baby boomers. Burns and Novick fall into that age group, but it is also their target audience with this film. When the two directors followed their reversed introductory video with former Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger's introductions that what we need now in this country is to heal the wounds and to put Vietnam behind us, speaks directly to the directors and perhaps Marlantes' shared generation. But it also presents a very clear image of the war to those who don't have any memory of the war, which includes myself. The film, bolstered by Marlantes' perplexed introductory question, what happened, asserts that the war remains a difficult topic globally and that the US's involvement in Vietnam, frankly, was a messy mistake that needs to be put behind the American national psyche, per the film. So how can Burns and Lynn Novick use Karl Marlantes as pictured here in various ages, receiving medals, etc., is interesting in that the average audience member wouldn't know who he was, besides a USMC, US Marine Corps veteran. In the final episode, he is identified as an author, but he does not, like Tim O'Brien, read from his works in the film or reference his laborious writing about the war. He doesn't indicate his publication credentials at all. That I don't know whose choice that was, but it's an interesting choice. But he's a general commentator on the war, much like the Vietnamese war writer and veteran Bao Ninh, who appears in nearly every episode, as well as a sort of translator for the North Vietnamese point of view throughout the war. But Ninh is also primarily identified as a veteran, not an author. The Vietnam War film uses several authors, Vietnamese and American, to sharpen its points, yet many critics have been quick to point out the lack of variety of voices. The film attempts to navigate a middle ground, but from the outset of the film, Burns and Novick admit that the uncomfortable truth is that whereas the war was in one sense an aberration from America's character, it was also an expression of it. Marlantes echoes this idea of flawed America several times in the film. At one point, he appears visibly upset when he discusses his, quote, bitterness about the political powers of the time, end quote, and those powers, quote, lying. Marlantes often takes the role of a reflective, logical commentator, and he methodically unpacks his feelings about the war and its political navigations. Burns juxtaposed his face, as you saw in the intro, with military funerals, flagged caskets, 21-gun salutes, and then his words are, I can't play all of the film for you, so here's another snippet. It's basically, in short, images usually associated with heroism, sacrifice, and valor appear with a narrative of disillusionment and anger, such as, I can understand a policy error that is incredibly painful and kills a lot of people out of a mistake if they made it with noble hearts. This is Marlantes speaking. That's, what Eisenhower and Kennedy were trying to figure out. And you read that, McNamara knew by 65, which was 3 years before I was there, that the war was unwinnable. That's what makes me mad. Making a mistake, people can do that. But covering up mistakes, then you're killing people for your own ego. And that makes me mad. Marlantes adheres to a popular political and historical trope in his recollection and Burns and Novick's storytelling here, or retelling. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy were decent people who began the Vietnam War in good faith out of fateful misunderstandings. But McNamara, Johnson, Kissinger, Nixon, Ford a little, prolonged the war because it seemed easier to muddle through than admitted had been caused by tragic decisions. Marlantes also notes that mistakes are inevitable, but killing people for your own ego denotes a line crossed. Investing American troops in an unwinnable war does not endear many a politician to their people. And Marlantes' lasting loyalty and respect for the Marines doubles down on the idea that the war was a waste. Marlantes simply represents another voice trying to make sense of it all as we get through this film. His loyalty to the Marine Corps, however, bolsters his argument that the faults of the war lie on the shoulders of the politicians, not on the shoulders of the soldiers. Another quote from the film that he says, "You have these 19-year-old kids with these huge hearts. They will do what you ask them. The issue is, are you asking them to do something worthwhile? That's up to the adults, and that's where the failure comes. The responsibility is on the grown-ups to make sure they're not being wasted, because they'll do what they're told and they'll do it well." This commentary from the 7th episode in the series lobs the failure of the Vietnam War on the adults. Young Marines do their jobs well, per Marlantes, but their efforts are wasted on causes not worthwhile. Warriors, according to Marlantes, do their job well because they are young with huge hearts and don't even ask you a question. As the first and later second lieutenant in the Corps, Marlantes was actually one of the adults. As an officer, in some ways, he ordered and led troops, asked them to do things, and so thus was also a grown-up with the responsibility of not wasting warriors. This is a topic he reflects on at length in his nonfiction book, What It Is Like to Go to War. He devotes an entire chapter to a more holistic training of soldiers for their own benefit. It's called The Enemy Within, and another to helping soldiers adjust to civilian life after combat, called Home. Marlantes' priorities still are the kids with the huge hearts. Of course, this was also Marlantes' job, and the film makes several pointed efforts to depict the veterans of the war on all sides as heroic in their own right, long overdue sentiment in U.S. films and books about the Vietnam War. Burns and Novick, as well as most of the veterans' features, argue that they were armed pawns in a larger political game. So Marlantes notes, excuse me, and Burns and Novick sees on his and others' admissions that many of the soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War were aware that the war was mired in doubtful intentions. Marlantes was in the Marine Reserves before he entered Yale University and was deferred from active duty thanks to a Rhodes Scholarship. But he had been in the ROTC, or the ROTC, before that. So he made it all the way to Oxford and then decided to forego his scholarship in favor of rejoining his friends in the Corps because he felt like he had abandoned them. The Vietnam War glosses over the months of soul searching that he did before making this decision, which is detailed in 2011, What It's Like to Go to War. In his book, Marlantes describes struggling with conflicting desires. He does not want to be a cocktail critic, but by the fall of 1967, he couldn't defend the war politically, and he thought it was a mistake. And that's in his book. Marlantes considered deserting the wrong war and, quote, pulled all of his scholarship money from the bank and went to Africa, harboring some vague idea that maybe Algeria and exile wouldn't be all that bad, end quote. After, quote, smoking all the hash and kiff, end quote, he could find, Marlantes decided to face the music and serve in Vietnam. This backstory behind the decision to serve in war he didn't believe in includes a love loss story, which is very common. I've been interviewing veterans for a class I'm teaching, and one of the questions we ask is, why did you enlist? And a lot of them say, I wanted to show a girl something, something. So that's one of the motivations from that era. So feeling torn between being a war hero and staying safe with your sweetheart isn't necessarily a unique story. And the additional period of drug use and escaping the situation is a pretty common path for many conflicted youth, including those who've enlisted in recent American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yet none of Marlantes' backstory is included in the Burns documentary film. Instead, Marlantes is a scholar and a patriot, the son of a World War II veteran who fought the Battle of the Bulge and had a wobble before ultimately deciding to go to war. As he reads the letter he wrote home to his parents regarding his decision to give up his scholarship and go to Vietnam, the earnest and idealistic views of a young man about to go to war are juxtaposed with images of coffins, flags, a combat zone, soldiers gearing up, a camp, a man saluting, a young man walking and making the peace sign, and finally a young Marlantes signature on the original letter. His any guy appeal is made through the images, but his letter is much more complex. His intelligence is evident as he parses out his feelings. And he says things that he has, the war's effect on him has resulted in feelings in his letter. He says increasing rage and frustration and a complete feeling of helplessness. And he thought that he has been hiding and admits his decision to join his compatriots is, quote, a highly immoral thing. I will be taking part in one of the greatest crimes in our century. From this perspective, Marlantes becomes a delightful paradox for Burns and Novick, an anti-war Rhodes Scholar whose loyalty to a sense of duty overrode his get out of Vietnam free card. But Marlantes' youth, framed in the film as a moment of masculine triumph, seeps through in the final sentences of his letter home. I can do something, he says. That I can do is my very best to get 40 kids out of Vietnam alive. And if I have to turn into an evil machine to do it, then by God, I will, end quote. So the illusion that any action would be better than inaction, at least for fulfilling a scholarship, and then becoming a different person, an evil machine, will make a difference, ultimately drives Marlantes' decision. He swears by God that his heroic mission to bring back 40 kids from Vietnam sounds very young. It's a bit heroic in retrospect, but at the same time, he sounds his age, which is fine, because he willingly joins this fight that he sees as, quote, one of the greatest crimes of our century to pacify his anger and ego, an irony based on his earlier comments on politicians that Marlantes does not miss. In both his book, What It Is Like to Go to War, and the Vietnam War documentary, Marlantes stresses that he felt like I was going to let my friends, the guys I'd trained with, down, that by not joining in with them and sharing the burden, then I wouldn't be a decent person. That's a mixed bag because I went over there to kill people for, is that why I did that? In the historical esprit de corps, we happy few, brothers in arms, and similar battle bonds that echo back to Greek and Roman literature, this motivation to join the fight isn't bizarre or unique. And furthermore, the U.S. Marine Corps is notorious in its ability to make cohesive, always faithful, Semper Fi is their logo, brotherhoods. But Burns and Novick use this vignette of Marlantes' internal struggle to illustrate the greater moral issues of the war from the Americans' perspective. The war served as a call to action. So photos here really fast. This caisson is the color photo, and then the Marines arriving on Da Nang Beach is there, and that's the DMZ bombing, an aerial photo of that. So the time Marlantes spent in country did not include winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese and CAG units or walking them through villages and hamlets. As the executive officer of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, 3rd Marine Division, Marlantes stayed largely south of the DMZ, fighting over hills and jungle battles. The Burns and Novick documentary emphasized that Marlantes' unit was fighting the same sort of war over the same sort of terrain that Marines had been fighting now for 4 years. One of the rare areas where Marlantes' books and the documentary converge. The soldiers in Marlantes' novel Matterhorn retake the same hill several times over, for example, and Marlantes discusses his plot's autobiographical roots and what it's like to go to war. So he says in the film that there was an overlooked dullness of combat, such as, quote, you would hear, well, it's going to be Operation Purple Martin 1 or Operation Scotland 2. And it'd be like, yeah, whatever. What that meant to us was someday soon, some choppers are going to show up and drop us into the jungle someplace or a valley north of us or wherever it was going to be. And then we'd be off the hill and humping, as we called it. His insouciant, yeah, whatever, and purposeful emphasis on the vagueness of his missions into a jungle someplace underscores the suspended time of battle. A great deal of time is spent waiting, walking, moving forward and back with little knowledge of exactly what space on Earth one really occupies. The landscape is blurred. What stands out, per Marlantes, is combat. Marlantes concludes What It Is Like to Go to War, arguing that the experience of the overt masculinity of war needs to be tempered with a feminine nurturing energy. His book tour talks, books, and comments in the Vietnam War all echo his enduring thesis of the innate aggression of humanity. He likens combat to crack cocaine and depicts the experience with similar mind-altering imagery. It's an enormous high, he says, but it has enormous costs. You're scared, you're terrified, you're miserable, but then the fighting starts. And suddenly everything is at stake. Your life, your friends' lives, it's almost transcendence because you're no longer a person. The combination of exhilaration and savage joy in overcoming your enemy, Marlantes posits, gives combat a primordial angle. This insight into what fighting in Vietnam was like appeals to the film's audience, and the imagery of combat troops in the jungle, emptying magazines in the battle, remind the audience what war looks like as they hear what it feels like. Burns and Novick's use of Marlantes' combat description is purposeful. Marlantes taps into the gritty poetry of war and he's able to make big ideas more of a soundbite. The act of war retains the romantic, mysterious energy that Burns and Novick have a history of perpetuating. So the voice and image of Karl Marlantes carries some of the burden of extending the Burns and Novick agenda. His books outside of the film's context are far less political and more philosophical in tone. In both his book, What It Is Like to Go to War, and the documentary film, Marlantes offers a glimpse of a solution, recognizing that war is merely an extension of innate aggressive tendencies in the human species. He furthers this idea with an echo of, oh boy, sorry, I just saw that, of historian Walter Hickson's thesis in The Myth of American Diplomacy, that American national identity is based on a manly, hegemonic, and racially superior discourse where war, like nothing else, forges the bonds of unity, loyalty, and patriotism. Wars, Hickson writes, even unpopular wars, pave the way for the next wave of pathological violence. Both Marlantes and Hickson recognize an inescapable violence in human nature perpetuated by U.S. national identity, but Marlantes sees the military and war experience as finishing school for that violent tendency in all of humankind. He suggests that by not recognizing a national level of aggressive tendencies, the United States will end up in wars, even unpopular ones. So I gotta get out of here. Come on. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so here's the bit that he speaks in this part of the documentary.
One of the things that I learned in the war is that we're not the top species on the planet because we're nice. We are a very aggressive species. It is in us. And people talk a lot about how, well, the military turns, kids into, killing machines and stuff. And I'll always argue that it's just finishing school. What we do with civilization is that we learn to inhibit and rope in these aggressive tendencies, and we have to recognize them. I worry about a whole country that doesn't recognize it, because you think of how many times we get ourselves in scrapes as a nation because we're always the good guys. Sometimes I think if we thought that we weren't always the good guys, we might actually get in less wars.
Make sure that pauses. All right, so back to this part. So this snippet of Marlantes' thoughts offers the film some hopeful redemption.
And I can't tell you a whole lot about the
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was one of the first people to be shot.
I didn't close you.
One round put me down.
That's a good part too. So this snippet offers Marlantes' thoughts and of the war's maybe hopeful redemption, even if they occur halfway through the documentary. This is in episode 5. He isn't espousing a simple give peace a chance message, but he is implying that there's another way to be the good guy without going to war. It just means we'd have to admit that humanity is inherently somewhat violent, a fact that the United States is rarely willing to admit, and a point that Burns and Novick seem to want to make clear. So the Vietnam War's use of Karl Marlantes' voice and image is purposeful and smart. He is an excellent speaker and makes obtuse ideas approachable. He doesn't get over emotional or ruffled, and his account for the film of his return to the US, as well as the subsequent public treatment he received as an active duty officer, is equal parts shock, bitterness, and measured. He explains his experience with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder with calmness and simplicity at the end of the film. He cultivates a healthy distance and curiosity for his time in service. Legend has it that Marlantes, it took him a decade to finish the book Matterhorn. In the Burns Novick documentary, his bio line states, Carl Marlantes lives near Seattle and spent 30 years writing a novel about his war. The film doesn't mention the singular novel's title, nor does it mention his other book, What It Is Like to Go to War, which also falls under the category of memoir. Marlantes still remains a veteran because it is in this capacity that he best serves the film's underlying theme. He is one of the film's unsung heroes. The veterans in this film must be made into heroes per the continued agenda of Burns and Novick. But in the case of the Vietnam War, their heroism must exhibit at least a cursory nod in the direction of anti-war sentiment. Marlantes walks a fine line between the good and bad elements of war in his books, lectures, and his interview for the film. His refusal of his Rhodes Scholarship and his impassioned letter home revived the patriotic spirits all war stories need. But Marlantes' personal story comes with the caveat that he disagrees with the war he's about to enter. This juxtaposition continues to create a romantic, mythological place for the Vietnam War. The film could not reconcile the divisions of the war because it could not breach the unavoidable trap of war. It is such a part of the human experience that it can't be a mistake or a bad war. Marlantes confirms that war is just war, a complex human act that, I lost my thread, that has existed as far back as humanity can recall. But the Vietnam War, the film, insists that this war was special in that it was an ill-laid plan from the start, and uses the words of a respected, credible author and veteran to assert this claim without regard for the sacred space war holds for him and others. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for coming. Here is my information if you need to contact me. And my book is out if you want to read more of the things I've said. So yeah, let me, whoops, get off of here.
Erin, thank you very much for your incredible presentation, a really interesting and enriching about the role of Carl Marlantes. Really, thank you. So during the course, our presentation and this seminar, we received so many questions that coming in for all the participants that interact in an incredible way. So David, we start with the round of questions for all the people that are here right now. So the first question is for Kirkland, Dr. Kirkland. What would Hanoi have committed so many forces to the area instead of committing them to the Tet Offensive? What do you think about that?
Okay, so thank you for the question. Can you, was it, I copied them and pasted them out of the chat. Was it, why would you say it again, the first question?
Yeah, of course. It's about what would Hanoi have committed so many forces to the area instead of committing them to the Tet Offensive?
Okay, yeah, so why would Hanoi have committed so many forces to the area instead of committing them to the Tet Offensive? So good question, and I think it kind of gets this to the broader question, a lot about the revisionism of the Battle of Khe Sanh and whether or not committing those forces was a feint or a ruse to convince U.S. forces to commit themselves more towards Khe Sanh and pull them out of the urban areas that was the main focus of the Tet Offensive. So the overall commander of North Vietnamese Army, General Giap, at one point he was post-war, he was interviewed by an Italian journalist who essentially asked him the same question, whether or not Khe Sanh was was it a feint or a ruse on behalf of the North Vietnamese? And he responded, no, Khe Sanh didn't try to be, nor it could have been a Dien Bien Phu. It gets back to that same question about whether or not Westmoreland and Johnson were consumed by not allowing Khe Sanh to be another Dien Bien Phu. And so Diop says that Khe Sanh wasn't that important to us. It was only important to the extent that it was important to the Americans. And so in fact, at Khe Sanh, their prestige was at stake, end quote, from that interview. So Diop is essentially saying, because US forces made holding on to Khe Sanh such an important thing, then they responded in kind, in hopes of damaging, the sort of in a information warfare sense, the prestige of American forces. I think that gets after the question. If not,
Yeah.
I can re-attack it.
Thank you very much. So I have other question for Dr. Tyler. Dr. Tyler, how did the Vietnam War influence US Army tactics and employment techniques by breaking existing doctrinal paradigms?
So I think this is a great question. I'm not sure that I can give you the most satisfactory answer on it. And I would open this up to other folks to reply on the specific sort of doctrinal adjustments. I do know that there was a lot of hand-wringing during the war from warfighters who insisted on changing tactics as a result of what they were encountering, but that would meet more and more resistance sort of the higher up you would go in the chain of command. And a lot of this comes back to the overall strategy of the war, which was one of attrition. And that attrition focus by Westmoreland and McNamara was really reflective of this view that the American way of fighting war would somehow be able to, choke out an insurgency. I look at some of the things the Marine Corps did later in the war in terms of living in villages and really trying sort of what they considered an early Hearts and Minds campaign. Like some of that stuff was really cutting edge. The Green Berets, for example, going in and living with people in these areas to root out insurgency. And I think one of the sad things is that, again, Westmoreland's view on this was to minimize some of those efforts that may, in hindsight, have really turned the tide and helped us to recognize the kind of fight that we were actually in. So, one of the things I would say about Vietnam are there are so many missed opportunities. There are so many lessons to learn, and I think that's one of them.
Thank you very much. And I have other for you, Tyler. Sorry. And the other student asked about, did the American intelligence know that Stalin and Mao really hate each other and trigger huge tension between them?
I'm sorry, say that first part again. I was having audio issues.
Okay, did the American intelligence know that Stalin and Mao really hate each other and trigger huge tension between them?
Yeah, I mean, there's some good indicators, right, that we had to look at. The biggest one was the fact that there was a shooting. There was basically a shooting war to some extent across the Russian-Chinese border at times, and that Soviet-Sino split. That was a little more evident than I think we like to go back and remember. Good analyst, good shop at places like the CIA should definitely have caught up on that. And again, I think going back to the message I'm trying to push here, I think with this is that trying to reconsider these questions and asking things that might go against the conventional grain could have maybe shed a little bit more light on that those relationships. I mean, asking the relationship now between the Russians and the Chinese, which Putin shows up and he's holding hands with Xi. I have a lot of questions about how far the Chinese would go to really support the Russians and what they're doing. I have a lot of questions about whether or not their national interests are actually aligned. So whenever we see those kinds of relationships, asking those additional questions and looking for evidence, I think is a really important thing. And I do think that some of that evidence did exist at the time for us to understand that split.
Thank you, Dr. Tyler. So I have other question for Erin about what was the role of Vietnam War veterans as Marines and their importance in keeping alive the memory of all those who fight there?
Okay, so the general role of okay. I think it's an integral one. It's one that I use a good deal of because I remember like early in my doctoral studies, I had a professor who said, you need primary sources. And I took that to mean you go to Vietnam and look at the things. And that definitely helped. One of the people who, right before I went the first time, was a Vietnam War veteran. He was like, this is what you might encounter and which some of it was wrong, some of it was right. He'd gone about 10 years prior when I went. But I think the primary role, though, is it's people who experienced the combat or the I'm thinking in terms of the Iraq War, so I'm using the wrong one, but like a FOB, an operating base kind of thing. Like they know what that was like, what eating was like, what the conditions were like, and things like that. And I think that is important and essential to telling the war. But I do think what's lucky for us is that we have people like Carl Merlantes and Paul Coelho and Tim O'Brien and all those folks who can give us that, because it's my understanding that in Vietnam, you only get one side, which is the North Vietnamese side. And anyone who served in the South didn't really, there are some books that are published in the United States that I've read. Like Michael P. Doe has a very good book about like his time serving in the South and then being put in the re-education camps and then his coming to America and things like that. But I definitely think these soldier stories, it's like, the Odyssey and all that kind of stuff. They're kind of part of human fabric. So I think that's their real help. Yeah. I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Nous avons une question pour la professeure Marie Plou. Et Marie, la bataille de Bien Phu ne peut être comprise sans comprendre l'histoire du Vietnam ni la future guerre du Vietnam avec les États-Unis. On pourrait dire que Bien Phu est le tournant de la retraite française et de l'entrée future des États-Unis au Vietnam?
Alors, je suis désolée, j'ai un problème de caméra. Est-ce que vous m'entendez au moins?
D'accord.
Vous m'entendez? Ok. Est-ce que vous pouvez reposer la question, s'il vous plaît? Can you repeat, please, your question?
La bataille de Bien Phu ne peut être comprise sans comprendre l'histoire du Vietnam ni la future guerre du Vietnam avec les États-Unis. Et on pourrait dire que Bien Phu est le tournant du retrait français et de l'entrée future des États-Unis au Vietnam.
Oui, alors I am a traductor. I speak in France, and after un interprète hablo en anglais. Donc, je dirais que les États-Unis ont été présents et ont soutenu les Français, la cause française durant toute l'intervention française et du corps expéditionnaire en Indochine.
So the U.S. supported the French intervention in Indochina ever since 1951 on a broad range from the financial level up to the weapon and equipment delivery.
Et donc les États-Unis ont été présents, ils ont soutenu au niveau du matériel et des finances. Et après la conférence de Genève, les États-Unis ont davantage été impliqués à cause de la guerre froide.
So after the Geneva Convention, the U.S. were more involved into the what would later be the intervention in Vietnam.
Et cela donc a été en dualité avec les relations avec les communistes. La conférence de Genève a développé l'opposition entre les États-Unis et les communistes, et donc par conséquent l'impact de l'intervention des États-Unis en Indochine.
This has to be seen under the larger picture of the Cold War and the fact that the U.S. intervention followed, well, the support in Indochina followed the war in Korea, and therefore with the containment doctrine, the support ever since, well, would later grow on to be the intervention, and would be on a more intermingling way, if I may say so, starting in 1962 is the involvement, well, boots on the ground.
Et la dernière chose qui est importante à retenir, c'est que à la suite, Dien Bien Phu est un marqueur dans le désengagement du soutien des États-Unis auprès de la France, car Dien Bien Phu avait promis du matériel et un soutien financier, mais s'est retiré au cours de la bataille et a causé, on va dire, un changement dans la stratégie.
The U.S. support was complete during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the battle would mark indeed a shift from the French, the fact that the dismantling of the Indochina would start right after Dien Bien Phu, and later in 1954 would mark a shift in which the French would start to hand out, if I may say so, the support and the involvement in Indochina to the US. And that would be faint between 1954 and 1962, and as I said, starting in 1962 and until what would later be the Vietnam War, the US support increased during the late 1950s.
Voilà. Est-ce que vous avez d'autres questions?
You are in mute, David.
Merci beaucoup, Marie, pour votre réponse.
Je vous en prie. Est-ce que vous avez d'autres questions?
Et non.
Puisque j'ai reçu une question sur l'impact de Dien Bien Phu dans la guerre froide. Est-ce qu'il faut y répondre ou pas?
Yeah, is our other, yeah. We have the other question.
D'accord, j'y réponds maintenant. Donc, ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est que Dien Bien Phu se situe après la conférence de Berlin, qui s'est déroulée du 25 janvier au 18 février 1954.
So the Battle of Dien Bien Phu takes its place right after the Berlin Convention.
Et cette conférence a eu une absence d'issue diplomatique, mis à part l'annonce de la conférence de Genève avec l'intégration de la Chine dans les négociations.
The Berlin Conference in early 1954 had no major diplomatic impact, yet it only had one effect. It was the entrance of China into the negotiation that would later take place at Geneva.
Cette conférence de Genève avait pour objectif de traiter de la question coréenne et de la paix en Indochine.
The Geneva Convention had two goals: to settle the Korean conflict, the Korean War, and to settle as well the dismantlement of Indochina.
Ce à quoi cela s'ajoute l'arrivée au pouvoir de Mao Tse-tung en Chine, qui soutient donc bien entendu les communistes, et donc Ho Chi Minh en Indochine.
The growing role of the Chinese support after Mao's arrival had a huge impact.
Et cela donc augmente les tensions avec les Occidentaux et donc le corps expéditionnaire français et le commandement français.
Now, one must not forget that the U.S. air intervention that was at once thought to take place during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was actually cancelled because of the fear of a Chinese response, and therefore the Geneva Convention was actually marked by the confrontation between China and the U.S.
Ainsi, la conférence de Genève est signée, est aboutie le 21 juillet 1954, et c'est la signature d'un cessez-le-feu et non une paix après 30 jours et 30 minutes pour parler, à cause de la présence communiste et chinoise dans cette conférence. Les États-Unis ont refusé la signature d'un traité de paix à cause de la présence communiste. Donc vraiment une importance dans la guerre froide.
So at the end of the Geneva Convention on July 21st, 1954, even though a ceasefire agreement was decided, there was no peace agreement. Actually, the U.S. refused to sign it because of the Chinese position. That would actually take place and would actually show the containment and would later explain their future involvement in Vietnam.
Et ce traité qui est signé aboutit donc à la séparation du Vietnam de l'Indochine en deux au 17e parallèle, avec l'interdiction d'introduire les troupes étrangères dans les deux zones. Par conséquent, c'est un peu un parallèle avec la Corée du Nord et la Corée du Sud.
So yes, it is actually a benchmark in the Cold War, because in a way, after the Geneva Convention, what would later be Vietnam was actually divided in two halves on the 17th parallel, and the agreement actually is pretty much similar to the one that was signed in Korea, with a standoff between two parts, one that would later be communists, and that would actually fall into one bloc, and another part, the southern one, that would actually align itself on the other bloc. So starting, yes, a new chapter of the Cold War.
Et le dernier élément en parallèle avec la guerre froide, c'est pour atténuer les tensions entre les Occidentaux et les Viet Minh, c'est l'acceptation de la libération de tous les prisonniers du corps expéditionnaire français en septembre 1944. Donc c'est la libération d'un tiers du corps expéditionnaire, le reste étant décédé à Dien Bien Phu ou dans les camps.
Yet, however, there was actually one move made by the Viet Minh. That was the liberation of all the POWs that had been taken at Dien Bien Phu. That would take place later on in September 1954, despite many casualties and the fact that many prisoners would never come back from the detention camps. That was actually a sign, a hand given to the French to show the goodwill of the Viet Minh after the war.
Voilà, j'espère avoir répondu à cette question.
Now, I hope my answer was actually on target.
Merci, maybe.
Je vous en prie.
So I have other question for Dr. Kirkland. So the next is about, was PMBN really planning a genuine attempt to take the Kisan?
So was the army of the North Vietnamese army really planning a genuine attempt to take Khe Sanh? Well, it's kind of the a version of the previous question, and I go back again to some of the interviews that General Diop gave after the war was over. Now, in some respects, is he justifying the fact that the Vietnamese forces, North Vietnamese forces, sent to conduct the attack and the siege, that they essentially were unsuccessful? So is he justifying that by saying, no, of course we had never intended to seize Khe Sanh. It was not another Dien Bien Phu for us. It was only important to the extent that it was important to the Americans. Again, I don't think that we really will know the true intentions until the Communist Party opens up records from dating in 1968 from the failures, and they just haven't done that yet. So it's sort of up in the air as to whether or not that the North Vietnamese really intended to seize Khe Sanh. Certainly the narrative that that Vietnam now has is that no, they never intended to do that. That was simply done only because the Americans were so intent on taking it. And I think that aligns with some of the other comments that the other panelists have given with respect to the narrative that Vietnam is painting about the war, always in a positive light for themselves. So hopefully that answers the question.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we can right now, for all attendees, participants, and speakers, remember that INISEG organized the 6th International Congress Challenge to Global Security. You can live the experience in person at the School of War of the Army of the Air in Spain. And also you can watch in streaming for those who are interested and in another part of the world. So save the days from April 26 to 28, and we'll be sent more information about that. So David, your final words for this amazing seminar.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias a todos los que habéis participado en este seminario sobre la guerra de Vietnam, en este primer día de estos 3 que va a durar hasta el viernes para analizar, contextualizar y reflexionar sobre el conflicto que llevó pues, a miles de norteamericanos a combatir en el sudeste asiático. Y también, evidentemente, hemos visto la parte de la reflexión francesa por parte de Marie sobre la batalla de Dien Bien Phu, una batalla importantísima para la historia militar de Francia. Y desde aquí también agradezco a todos vosotros por haber participado en este seminario, en este primer día, y también, evidentemente, a todos los asistentes, a todos los alumnos que habéis estado en tantas horas escuchando y siguiendo todas estas importantísimas y importantes conferencias de estos grandes panelistas que hemos tenido hoy en este seminario de la guerra de Vietnam, promovido por INISEG. Así que muchas gracias y nos vemos mañana en la siguiente jornada, donde tendremos más ponentes, donde nos detallarán otros temas importantísimos de la guerra de Vietnam. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Laura.
And other thing as is from INISEG, we want to say thank you to all participants, attendees, and speakers who were on day 1 of this incredible INISEG University seminar, the Vietnam War. It has been an incredible topics and round on question for everyone. And we have lived again the history in this military history seminar, and see you tomorrow with more content of this seminar. See you and next time.